Our story begins in a vast forest. A wide, sprawling expanse of trees stretches out endlessly, and in the middle of it all stands our main protagonist, taking it all in. He reflects on how, when the world was ending and everyone else was consumed by fear and chaos, he felt something else, something strange. Even now, as we see flashes of him fighting massive magical beasts, that feeling is still there. He doesn't quite understand it. Was it calm? Peace? Even in the thick of danger, surrounded by death, there was a thrill. Whether he was firing arrows from a distance or clashing blades in close combat, something about the chaos made him feel alive. He was in his element, covered in blood, fighting for survival. It all just made sense. This new world felt like it was built for him. It wasn't peace he felt. No, it was something deeper. It was pure excitement. But it wasn't always like this. Back before the fall of the world, he was a quiet, awkward guy. Shy, isolated, someone who found it hard to make friends. He used to listen to radio shows about how to hold conversations and the basics of small talk. Tips and tricks just to seem normal. One of the first tips: make eye contact. Show you're paying attention. He remembered standing next to a woman with vibrant purple hair, wondering if she was looking at him. He turned toward her just to check, and maybe because of that, she decided to speak to him. She asked about his weekend. He told her it was good and asked about hers. She said she and her husband had planned to go fishing at the lake but were stopped by bad weather. Eventually, she stepped out and left him alone in the elevator. The doors closed. He let out a sigh and facepalmed, frustrated by how bad he was at this. He couldn't understand what was wrong with him. In his thoughts, he explained how difficult it had always been to make real connections. He had moved out of state to take a new job, hoping for a fresh start. But even after years, nothing had changed. He still felt like a stranger wherever he went. In a world that placed such high value on social skills, he felt completely out of place. He started wondering if things would ever be different. Even in his childhood, he had only tried solo activities. Archery was his favorite, one of the few things that brought him peace. But that peace always came alone. It felt like the world just wasn't made for people like him. Day in, day out, he sat in his cubicle, a quiet, gray space that stretched endlessly between morning and noon. Time crawled. No family in the city, no friends at the office, no one even knew his name. Well, almost no one. Out of nowhere, someone appeared behind him, calling out, "Jake." It was a man with blonde hair. Adam. Adam asked Jake if he wanted to join him and a few others for lunch. Jake considered it for a moment. Adam was the opposite of him. Confident, outgoing, effortlessly likable. The kind of person who could lead a room without even trying. And somehow, Jake still liked him. Adam never made Jake feel small. He didn't mind doing the talking, and that made things easier. Normally, Jake would have said no. He'd avoid situations like this to prevent the awkwardness he always feared. But maybe because it was Adam, he thought it might be different. So he said yes. They walked to the elevator, and as the doors opened, two well-dressed women stood inside. One of them was Caroline, the bright-haired woman from Human Resources. As always, Adam dove into conversation without missing a beat. He invited them to lunch too, promising to use the company card. Jake tried not to look at Caroline. Still, Jake couldn't help but think that Caroline was one of the few bright spots in that dull office. Her energy was different. He admired her from a distance. Now they were all riding down together. Caroline turned to Adam and playfully warned that he'd get fired one day for abusing the company card. Then she turned to Jake. She said it was rare to see him out with the group, that it was unusual to see him socializing. Jake smiled faintly to himself. She didn't use his name. She never did. He wondered if she even knew it. Maybe that's why she never spoke to him directly. As always, her attention drifted back to Adam. Jake watched her, thinking about how she lit up in conversations with others, how effortlessly she fit in. But then the elevator shook. It wasn't subtle. Everyone inside stopped talking. The light above them flickered. Caroline looked around in confusion. Adam calmly said it was probably just an electrical issue, nothing serious. No reason to panic. But then the second tremor hit. This one was worse, sharp and sudden. Alarms blared. The ground below them groaned. The elevator jolted violently. Adam, snapping into action, told Jake to hit the emergency stop. Jake did, but nothing happened. Caroline stared at the controls, screaming about it not working, and still yet nothing happened. And in that moment, for the first time, it wasn't surprise or being startled they felt, but a deep fear set into their eyes. Just then, the lights inside the elevator shut off completely, leaving everyone in total darkness. From the back, a woman named Joanna spoke up, asking why the power had suddenly gone out. No one had an answer. They were still shaken from the tremors when Adam, trying to keep everyone calm, asked if everyone was okay. Then, without warning, something appeared in the dark. A glowing notification window floated in the air in front of them, as if it had been waiting all along. The message was clear: the 93rd universe's invitation had been accepted, and the tutorial sequence was about to begin. It wasn't just them. All over the world, people saw the same message. Even far beyond Earth, on a completely different planet, a strange creature looked up and saw it too. This alien being spoke to itself in a gloomy tone, saying that the people from this universe would be nothing more than lambs to the slaughter. Before Jake could make sense of any of this, everything changed again. Suddenly, he was no longer in the elevator. He didn't even know where he was anymore. He looked around but saw no sign of the others. It was just him, alone, in a strange place that made no sense. In front of him stood a creature unlike anything he had ever seen. It looked otherworldly but spoke politely, introducing itself to Jake. But Jake was too shocked to respond. He ignored the greeting and asked what the creature even was. The creature answered, saying it was the entity in charge of helping him adjust to this new reality. Just then, a 5-minute countdown appeared above the creature. The timer had started, and the entity said they had limited time, urging Jake to listen carefully. Jake asked what kind of reality this was. In response, a blue system window appeared in front of him. It showed various details and stats about Jake. According to the screen, his race was human, but he had no class, no profession, and no titles. His other stats were also low. Obviously, things like strength, dexterity, and endurance were barely developed, likely because they hadn't mattered in his normal life until now. The entity explained that this screen was called a system list. It would display important stats and other information Jake would need to survive in this new world. It also mentioned that the moment Jake's universe passed the bare minimum requirement for entry into the multiverse, the system had begun initializing it. That was all the information it could give for now. The rest would come later when needed. Jake took a second to process everything. He wasn't sure whether this was all amazing or just ridiculous. But before he could get too deep into his thoughts, the entity told him it was time to pick a class. Another screen opened, showing different weapons and symbols, each representing a class. Jake scrolled through them one by one. Each class offered different stat bonuses and abilities. There were a lot of options, but Jake didn't want to rush the choice. He wanted the one that felt right. For a moment, he considered the caster class. It had potential. But then he saw the archer class, and as soon as he looked at it, something about it just felt right to him. He chose the archer. The blue system window confirmed his selection. The entity, now aware that time was almost up, continued the introduction. Jake was told he would be sent to something called the Great Forest Tutorial Zone. There, he'd face monsters and challenges. Each victory would earn him tutorial points, or TP, which he could use to unlock stronger skills. If he gathered enough TP, he might even be able to fight the powerful beasts known as Beast Lords. Jake asked how long the tutorial would last. The entity answered that it would continue for 64 days. When it ended, those who survived would be ranked and rewarded based on the number of TP they earned. That was the last thing the entity revealed. A bright blue glow began to surround Jake's body. He was being teleported. He felt a rush through his chest, a sudden wave of energy. But instead of feeling scared, Jake felt something else. Excitement. Another blue screen appeared, letting him know that the introduction was complete. His new reality had officially begun. Now, Jake and his co-workers were standing in a massive forest, surrounded by tall trees and thick vegetation. They were all wearing new armor and gear suited for battle. Most of them looked confused, trying to make sense of their new appearances. But Jake didn't seem worried. He admired his new archery equipment, quietly impressed by how natural it all felt. As the group tried to figure out where they were, Adam stepped forward. Always the leader, he tried to calm everyone down and get them focused. But before he could say much, the ground began to rumble beneath them. Cracks started to form under their feet, and the earth opened up into a growing fissure. Adam hesitated, unsure whether to panic or keep trying to reassure the others. Either way, it was clear that something was pulling them downward. At the same time, in another part of the forest, a different group was moving through the trees. They were cautious, moving slowly, when a rustling sound came from the bushes nearby. The group leader raised a hand to signal the others to stop. He asked if anyone else had heard it, then prepared his blade for whatever might be coming. He called out, telling whoever was hiding to reveal themselves. From the bushes, a blonde-haired boy appeared. He looked scared and held up his hands. He apologized and said he didn't want any trouble. He explained that he got separated from his group and was trying to find them again. One of the women in the group, who had green hair, noticed how young the boy looked. She felt bad for him. The leader also relaxed a bit and told the boy they wouldn't hurt him. They asked when he last saw his group, and the boy said they had been attacked. He got separated during the chaos. The leader and the woman looked at each other. If the fight had happened a while ago, his group could be anywhere by now. Still, they told the boy he could stay with them for now. They promised to help him find his people. The boy smiled and thanked them. He looked grateful, but as he spoke about how scared he had been to be alone in the forest, something else was revealed. Behind him, hidden from view, was his sword, still stained with blood. And just like that, it became clear to us that things might not be what they seemed. Somehow, Jake and the rest of the group had survived the ground splitting apart. Now, they were walking under the thick canopy of trees in the forest, trying to make sense of their new surroundings. They stopped walking when Joanna asked what they were supposed to do next. Another member of the group then spoke up, wondering if he was the only one who had seen that strange alien-like creature earlier, referring to the entity. Adam reassured everyone. He said that they just needed to take things one step at a time and that everything would work out eventually. Watching him, Jake couldn't help but think that Adam really did seem like a natural-born leader. Once they started moving again, Adam suggested that their first priority should be to find shelter, water, and food. As they moved through the forest and tried to learn how to use their new skills, Jake kept thinking about the other pillars he had seen from above during the introduction. If those were anything like theirs, then his group wasn't the only one out there. That meant there were other survivors too. While Joanna stood nearby, amazed at having just cast her first spell, Jake thought about how important this early stage was. It was their chance to get used to the system and figure out how it all worked. He also noted that their group seemed pretty balanced. Their teamwork was already showing signs of potential. That became clear when Adam wrestled a deer to the ground and held it in place just long enough for Jake to land a clean shot with his bow. Afterward, Caroline moved in to heal Adam's injuries. They were starting to understand their roles and how to support one another. Adam and Caroline even looked a little awkward during the healing. That night, they all gathered around a bonfire. Caroline looked across the flames at Jake and mentioned how surprised she was by how well he handled his bow. She told him he was really good at using it and seemed impressed. Jake, who had always felt invisible to people like her, didn't know what to say. The fact that she knew his name meant a lot to him, but he couldn't bring himself to say anything. He just looked down, unsure of how to respond. To change the subject, Adam jumped in and suggested that Jake help him as a team captain. Jake quickly turned the offer down. He said he wasn't cut out for leadership and that he wasn't good at talking to people the way Adam was. Adam didn't argue. He just pointed out that this was a new world and that the old rules didn't matter anymore. He wanted Jake to understand that maybe he didn't need to be the same person he was before. A few hours later, it was time for the first night watch. Jake and Joanna were on duty. The forest was quiet. In the stillness, Joanna tried to talk. She told Jake that she and her husband had planned to meet up for lunch the day everything changed. She figured he had probably been nearby when it all started. Trying to get Jake to open up, she asked if he had someone in his life, if he had a girlfriend. Jake said no, at least not anymore. Then he started to talk about his past. He said that back in college, he had two real friends, a guy named Andy and a girl named Madeline. Andy had been his roommate, and Jake described him as a genuinely good guy, the kind of person you could trust completely. And Madeline, she was the girl Jake had fallen in love with. Like him, she wasn't very social. But when they were together, that didn't matter. They enjoyed each other's company and preferred quiet moments. At least, that's what Jake believed. He told Joanna that those had been the happiest years of his life. Or maybe he had just convinced himself of that. Because while he was busy falling in love, he didn't realize what was happening right in front of him. The two people he trusted most, the girl he loved and the friend he would have trusted with his life, were apparently more than just friends behind his back. Joanna listened quietly. When he was finished, she said that maybe he was better off without people like that in his life. But then her voice began to crack. Already in tears, she admitted that thinking about her own husband left her feeling sick. The worry never stopped. She kept imagining what he might be going through. Jake saw that she was hurting. He thought about saying something to comfort her. But before he could, Joanna stood up and asked to be excused. Without waiting for a reply, she walked off into the forest, disappearing into the trees. Jake sat there for a moment, thinking, maybe Adam was right. Maybe he did need to step up. Joanna had chosen to talk to him. Caroline had remembered his name. That didn't usually happen to someone like him. Maybe things could be different now. Maybe in this new world, he didn't have to stay in the background anymore. Just as he was thinking about all this, a scream tore through the night. It came from deep in the forest. Jake didn't hesitate. He knew the situation could be dangerous, and someone might be in trouble. Without wasting a second, he grabbed his bow and ran straight toward the sound. When Jake arrived, he saw three men surrounding Joanna. One of them stepped forward and threatened her, demanding to know where her group was hiding. But Joanna, brave and loyal despite her situation, kept insisting that she didn't know. She refused to say anything, no matter how hard they pushed. The leader of the thugs eventually gave up trying to get answers the easy way. He looked her in the eyes and told her she could have it her way. Without another word, he struck her leg with a brutal attack, smashing it to pieces. Her blood sprayed across the forest floor as she let out a scream of pure agony. Then, out of nowhere, a flurry of arrows came flying in toward the three men. One arrow hit its mark cleanly, going straight through one thug's neck. He dropped instantly. The other two managed to block or dodge the remaining arrows. One of them spotted where the arrows had come from and shouted to the other to go after the archer. Without hesitation, the man took off in that direction. He ran deeper into the trees, but eventually stopped when he realized there was no one in sight. Just as he looked around, Jake leapt from the shadows and drove an arrow into the side of the man's neck. But the man didn't go down easily. He let out a roar, grabbed Jake, and threw him aside with surprising strength. He reached for his giant axe and charged at Jake, swinging wildly. Jake blocked the first hit with his bow, but the weapon cracked under the pressure. He knew it wouldn't hold much longer. As he backed away, his eyes darted to Joanna, who had passed out from the pain. Blood pooled beneath her, and her leg looked like it had been torn clean off. Then Jake froze. He suddenly remembered the third thug, the one who had stayed behind. That's when he felt it, a presence behind him. He turned just in time to see the remaining thug about to land a devastating blow. And worse, an arrow came flying in from another direction. There was an archer, a fourth man. Jake stood in the middle of it all, surrounded and outnumbered. He felt like it was over. He didn't see a way out, so he closed his eyes and focused, bracing for the end. But then, something strange happened. He could feel them, the two enemies around him. It was like time slowed down, not from a spell or any kind of magic. This was something else. A system notification appeared in front of him. It said that a new ability had awakened, Bloodline of the Primal Hunter. Jake didn't know what that meant, but he could feel the change. His instincts sharpened. His vision narrowed. His eyes began to glow red. Then he moved. In one smooth motion, he dodged the attack from behind. The arrow flying toward him was caught mid-air. Without thinking, he threw it back at one of the thugs and watched as it pierced the man's chest, killing him on the spot. Jake stared at his hands, stunned. But he didn't freeze. He sprinted to grab a blade off the ground and used it to finish off the other attacker. The enemy archer, hidden nearby, fired a volley of arrows toward Jake. But Jake blocked every single one. His movements now too fast, too precise. Then, Jake stepped forward and dropped his blade, taunting the last remaining thug to face him directly. The enemy, shaking but desperate, stepped out from the bushes and charged at Jake, grabbing his coat with one hand and raising a dagger with the other. He looked Jake in the eyes and asked what the hell he was. Jake didn't answer. He grabbed an arrow and drove it into the man's eye. The thug collapsed to the ground, screaming. Jake picked up another arrow and stabbed it into the man's chest. Then another, then another. He kept going until the man stopped moving. By the time the rest of the group arrived, it was already over. They looked around the clearing, shocked. Two corpses lay on the ground. Adam and the other members of the group stepped forward and asked what had happened. All he said was, "I won." Laying there in the dirt, Jake had a grin on his face. But it wasn't relief or pride. Our main protagonist Jake flashes back to when he was younger and in school, remembering a time he had tried to help a girl who was being bullied. His kind attempt, yet, was met with nothing but dread by the girl, who seemed completely mortified at the sight, even asking him what the hell he was doing. Both boys were sent to the office and then suspended for fighting. This was when Jake finally understood that in their world there was absolutely no difference between the good guys and the bad. Back in the present, Caroline hurries to our main protagonist, asking him if he is okay. She is worried because of the amount of blood on him, but Jake shrugs it off, unaffected, making sure to let her know that none of the blood on him is actually his. Just then, a system notification appears in front of him, showing him the experience he has earned after the fight. Much to his surprise, because he didn't think they got points for killing survivors as well. A smile plays on Jake's face as he has just realized he gained a new skill. Bloodline of the Primal Hunter, wondering to himself what exactly a bloodline even is. Adam comes up to Jake asking him who exactly their attackers were and why they would even attack them. Jake tells Adam why he feels they were attacked, most likely as a result of the need for experience or tutorial points, noting the high amount he just got from that fight alone, telling them all they need to reconsider their survival strategy. They suggest finding a safe place to hide and waiting out the tutorial, but as Jake and Adam stood discussing, Jake was called by Caroline. Slowly rising to her feet, she asks Jake why Joanna was alone. Jake tries to answer her, telling her that Joanna seemed anxious and he felt she needed space. Caroline, however, was not having it, yelling at him and telling him Joanna isn't doing well. She continues telling him that Joanna's leg is too crushed for her healing abilities and asks him what exactly they should do. Jake, surprised by this, asks Caroline if she is blaming him for the events. Adam quickly jumps in, recognizing that he helped save her, but even with that, why would he let her go off on her own without waking them up? He ends it by asking Jake what he was thinking. Jake begins to show bits of his shy former self stuttering while trying to explain that the choice he took was a split-second one, following his instincts. They ask Jake to give his actions some thought next time, as they are humans and not beasts after all, asking him what if his actions had ultimately led to his death out there. Jake, a little frustrated, reiterates his apology, but Caroline cuts him off, yelling at him, asking what exactly he would have done if Joanna had died. The question halts the air as the tension grows. Jake clenches his fist and finally yells back, shouting at the people with him to get a grip, reminding them that Joanna only survived because of the action he took, telling them that if he had taken the time to wake them, no one knows exactly what could have happened. He moves to Adam, questioning him if, when it came to it, he would have the balls to take someone else's life. He reminds them that the world has now changed and they should stop expecting anyone to hold their hands. They need to learn to adapt if they want to survive. Bertram quickly responds, asking Jake just what exactly he suggests they do. Jake, already preparing to walk away, stops and turns to face them, telling them he suggests they do whatever they need to level up and make it through the situation they find themselves in. He tells them they need to do what the system wants them to do and they need to stop blaming him because they haven't caught up. And with our main protagonist walking away from the group, all they can do is watch him go. The next morning, as our protagonist wakes up, he hears a voice telling him he is finally up. The voice turns out to be Casper, who is sitting next to him. He rubs his eyes as he wakes up and tells Casper that he half expected that everyone would have ditched him by the time he woke up. Casper acknowledges that it was a thought, but after talking it out, they all decided they needed to start pulling their weight. Jake has a flashback about him and Casper at the old job and how, besides Adam, Casper was the closest thing he had to a friend back at that job. He thought about how they bonded over their poor romantic lives. He still really likes having him around even now. Just then, Joanna walks towards our main, and a look of pure shock washes over him. Joanna, now one limb short, still stands confidently in front of him as Casper explained they couldn't figure out how to save her leg, so this was the next best option, saying it was Joanna's idea. He goes on to say just how they hope that when they level up, Caroline will learn some sort of regrowth magic. All this shocks Jake, who just knows how Caroline might actually be the toughest out of them all. Out adventuring, Jake can't help but remark on how everyone is really giving it their all. He remarks on how Bertram is the best fighter there besides him, and commenting on how Joanna is also making use of her ranged magic. But even with all that, Caroline is the most impressive, though. He knows that what happened with Joanna has seemingly awakened something in Caroline. But even with the potions they got in their beginner gear, or at least that some of them got, none of them were powerful enough to fix Joanna's leg. And without knowing how to make more potions, Caroline has proven to be a valuable asset. But even at that, they haven't spoken a word to each other since the night before. Jake doesn't know who is supposed to talk to whom first. He ultimately decided that pretending like nothing happened was the best way to resolve the issue. An hour after the battle against the giant badgers, Casper and Jake aim to test Jake's ability to perceive incoming projectiles by having Casper hurl a ball of mud at him while he is blindfolded. This doesn't work, however, and the mud hits him with a loud splat, leaving the main character perplexed as to why the ability didn't activate. Jake ultimately draws the conclusion that the ability didn't activate since Casper didn't really want to actually harm him. Their training session was then interrupted by Adam, who calls out to them, telling them it's time to call it a day and find some shelter for the night. While wondering, they find a cave they deem to be a safe place, where they would at least be protected from the rain if nothing else, and they head in. And as they do, Jake can't help but see the cave as protection from possible ambushes from different people, telling himself that so long as he stays alert, they will be safe from more attacks. Still thinking about Joanna and last night, Adam walks up to our skilled archer and asks him if he is still thinking about what happened the night before, to which he simply says he just doesn't want to repeat the same mistakes twice. Adam finally apologizes to him for how he acted then, before he walks in with the torch leading the group in with him. Jake looks at him fondly, stating that the group most likely wouldn't have survived without Adam's leadership. Even he wouldn't have survived without him. We get another flashback of when Jake and Adam met for the first time, when Adam personally requested to have him on his team, causing our then shy protagonist to blush and stutter. As they head into the cave, they hear an ominous sound, leaving them wondering what exactly that could have been. Then again the sound came, and again, but this time causing the cave to crack as it sounded and causing debris to fall from above. Jake panicked and yelled that the team needed to go. As they ran, Jake noticed Caroline was about to be hit, calling out to her desperately, reaching out. The team was running for their lives as the cave behind them began to collapse, each second bringing them closer to being buried alive. Jake glanced back and saw Caroline, the healer, struggling to keep up. Massive chunks of rock were falling behind her, and at the pace she was going, she wouldn't make it out in time. Without a second thought, Jake tightened his grip on his bow and took off toward her. He sprinted forward with incredible speed, his eyes locked on her. Just as a massive boulder came crashing down, he lunged and grabbed her, pulling her away from death at the very last second. The stone slammed into the ground where she had been a moment earlier, blocking the path and trapping both of them behind a wall of debris, cut off from the rest of their group. Even though they hadn't spoken much since their last encounter, Jake immediately asked if she was alright, and Caroline confirmed that she was okay. On the other side of the wall, Adam's voice called out, filled with worry. He shouted their names, hoping they could hear him. Caroline moved to respond, but Jake quickly stopped her. He told her to stay quiet, pointing out how unstable the cave was. Loud voices could trigger another collapse. He also warned that they didn't know what kinds of creatures might be lurking in the shadows, possibly tracking them through sound. Caroline nodded again, this time more seriously, realizing the truth in his words. As they inspected the wall of fallen rock, it became clear that it was far too thick to dig through. Even with effort, there was no way they'd be able to move all that stone. On the other side, Bertram stepped forward and suggested breaking through it with his hammer. But Adam immediately shut the idea down, saying that the vibrations could cause the entire cave to come down on them. Joanna, now visibly shaken, begged them not to leave Jake and Caroline behind. Trying to stay calm, Adam explained that the cave had other paths. He told her the best thing they could do now was keep moving forward and hope the tunnels would eventually connect again. If there was an intersection somewhere deeper in, they might reunite with them. Jake, overhearing the conversation from the other side, understood that Adam's assumption wasn't a guarantee. But it was still their best option. So he suggested that he and Caroline head further into the cave on their side, looking for a way to circle back. Jake felt confident he could handle whatever threats they encountered on his own. But having Caroline with him made things more complicated. He wasn't sure he could keep her safe if something attacked them. Caroline, probably in an attempt to stay strong, told their leader that they would be fine, and she confidently said she didn't plan on dying in some cave. Our main protagonist let out a small smile at her words. An hour passed and Adam and the others continued walking, but the mood had shifted. Doubt was creeping in. Adam was starting to wonder if leaving Jake and Caroline behind had been a mistake. Bertram tried to reassure him. He pointed out that, in a lot of ways, Jake and Caroline were probably better suited to surviving down there than the rest of them. He admitted that Jake made him uncomfortable, but there was no denying the truth. Jake was the strongest member of their party. And with Caroline's healing abilities, the two of them stood a better chance than anyone. Adam looked at him, confused. Bertram continued, explaining that while he respected Jake's commitment to survival, something about him didn't sit right. He couldn't forget the way Jake had looked after the fight with the thugs. That grin, that expression. Jake lying in a pool of blood with that twisted smile on his face. To Bertram, it wasn't the look of someone who had just survived. It was the look of someone who had enjoyed what he had done. Adam didn't want to believe it. He brushed the concern aside and said that Jake had only acted that way because of the situation. Because of what he'd gone through. Bertram nodded, but reminded him that people change in times of crisis. He said Jake was becoming something unpredictable. A wild card, but Adam stayed firm. He remarked about how Jake is his friend and he chooses to trust him for now. On the other side of the stone wall, Jake found himself alone with Caroline. She turned to him and noticed something that he hadn't. Blood was slowly soaking through the sleeve of his shirt. It was clear he had been injured, probably during the fall. She pointed it out, and when Jake looked at his arm, the realization hit him that he hadn't even felt the wound until now. She told him to stop moving so she could heal him, but Jake hesitated. There was still some tension between them, and he wasn't sure if she was still angry. He asked, cautiously, if she was really okay with helping him after everything that had happened earlier. Caroline replied plainly. She might have been upset before, but that didn't mean she was going to let his wound get worse. It wasn't about liking or disliking him. She simply wasn't the kind of person to let someone suffer just because they'd had a disagreement. She told him to hold still and began channeling her healing magic. As she worked, Jake stood awkwardly, unsure what to say. The silence stretched and he could feel the weight of it. He started to run through mental notes trying to recall what he had learned about talking to people in moments like this. Small talk, questions, anything to break the stillness. Before he could get far, Caroline spoke up again. She told him he needed to be more careful. Just because he was strong now didn't mean he was invincible. Everyone knew what Jake was capable of, but even the strongest could fall if they were reckless. She went on to mention that she was still learning. Her magic wasn't unlimited, and there were times it failed her. There would be wounds she couldn't fix if people didn't give her time or let her improve. Jake listened and then asked her why she had chosen the healer class in the first place. Out of everything she could have picked, why healing? Caroline deflected the question with one of her own, asking why he had gone with Archer. Jake explained that he chose what felt most practical, something that would help him survive. Caroline echoed his thought. She said survival was her reason too. She admitted that she didn't know much about the tutorial itself or what it all meant. But she had played enough games back in the old world to understand the basics. Healers were usually the least popular class, mostly ignored by others. But she had learned early on that people always needed a healer. No matter the game, there was always demand. Jake asked if she still played games and she told him not anymore. Then she shared something personal. Back when they were kids, her younger brother had been sick a lot. He spent more time in hospitals than at home, and there were long stretches where she wasn't allowed to visit him. During those weeks apart, the only way they stayed close was by playing online games together. Jake hadn't known she had a brother. It was a quiet reminder that there was still so much about Caroline he didn't understand. She laughed a little and said that people always made her play the healer class just because she was a girl. At first, she hated it. She wanted to be a fighter, like everyone else, maybe someone who could deal massive damage and charge into battle. But over time, she noticed something. The damage dealers always struggled to find teams. They had raw power but no one to support them. Meanwhile, as a healer, she was always in demand. Everyone wanted her on their side. It didn't matter what the game was. As long as she could heal, people made room for her. They protected her, and in return, she kept them alive. She said this tutorial didn't feel all that different. As she adjusted the wrap on Jakey's arm, she admitted that she didn't know who they would meet deeper in the forest or what threats were waiting. But if she could offer something useful, something like healing, then she would always be valued. People would guard her not out of kindness, but because they needed her. That was to be her way of surviving. Jake found himself a little surprised by her reasoning. It was smart. Not just the logic of it, but the way she'd thought it all through, and he told her as much. Caroline gave a tired sigh and asked if he had ever really thought about her before. Whether he had simply seen her as the red-haired beauty, the former HR worker, and not much else. She wondered if he had underestimated her, probably not out of malice, but because he hadn't looked past the surface. Jake didn't answer right away. He began to wonder if she was right. Maybe he had admired her from a distance, maybe even liked her, but had he ever truly tried to understand who she was? She tied the last knot on the bandage and told him he was good to go. Then, without waiting, she said they needed to keep moving and headed further into the cave. Time passed as they walked, and eventually they came to a split in the tunnel. Two paths stretched ahead, one leading left, the other right. Caroline turned and asked what they should do. Jake didn't answer immediately. He listened instead. The cave seemed to breathe with quiet noises, soft scraping and distant echoes. Something about it felt unnatural. He told Caroline he couldn't sense anything directly, not yet. His perception skill hadn't activated. But even so, something didn't feel right. There was a pressure in the air, a weight. He asked her if she felt it too. Then, in the distance ahead, barely visible in the darkness of the tunnel, a wall of tiny blue eyes stared back at them, hundreds maybe more, all motionless, all waiting. Jake looked at them and gave the faintest of smiles. Something terrifying was down there, and it was waiting for them. Jake stood at the mouth of a shadowed path deep in the cave, caught in a strange pull between excitement and cautious warning. Something powerful lurked in the darkness, and every instinct in him screamed caution. Still, a part of him was drawn to it. It was as if the danger itself was calling to him, whispering promises of strength and purpose. He turned to Caroline, suggesting that they investigate the path ahead. The red-haired healer immediately questioned him, shocked he would even consider going in that direction. But Jake, unable to explain the strange craving inside him, argued that whatever was ahead had to be strong, and that kind of strength meant a lot of experience points. If they wanted to grow, if they wanted to survive long-term, they had to chase challenges like this. To him, it only made sense. Caroline, trying to pull him back to reality, reminded him of their actual goal. They were out here to find their friends. Not to grind for points like this was some sort of game. She looked at him like he'd lost it, completely bewildered by how he could be thinking like that in their situation. Jake pushed again, insisting that they didn't know where their friends were anyway, and that the dangerous path might even lead to them. He didn't believe that, not entirely, but it was the only justification he had. Still, she wasn't buying it. With her arms crossed and her face set, she pointed out that if they were wrong, they'd be throwing themselves into a death trap for nothing. At least the safer path led in the direction they'd come from. At least that one made sense. Jake tried to press one last time, saying that the dangerous path guaranteed something, even if it was just the experience. He argued that the tutorial world they were stuck in probably wanted them to take that route anyway, to push them into becoming stronger whether they liked it or not. Caroline had enough. She rubbed her forehead and let out a sigh, clearly frustrated. To her, this wasn't a trial or a challenge with rules to be figured out. It was real life. She told him to stop treating it like some game where everything had to be optimized. This was about survival, not chasing whatever twisted thrill had gotten into his head. Jake paused, thinking about it for a moment. And deep down he realized she was right. None of his reasons were logical. He admitted to himself that he simply wanted to fight. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't necessity. He just wanted to see what was waiting for him down there. Caroline, calmer now, said that even if Jake enjoyed fighting, the rest of them weren't looking to risk their lives for something so meaningless. To her, survival came first. Everything else could wait. Jake looked away, hesitating, then asked what was so wrong with wanting more. He didn't understand why they should settle for just making it through the day when they had been given the chance to live lives unlike anything possible in the old world. They could be extraordinary now. Why cling to mediocrity? But Caroline snapped back without hesitation. Not everyone wanted this. Some of them preferred the old world. They didn't ask for this new reality, and they certainly didn't ask to become killers. She urged him to stop thinking only of himself, and to think about the others who were depending on him to make the right choice. Jake looked up again. The cave above still creaked and shifted, the air around them tense and unstable. He realized that his mindset wouldn't help anyone. With a breath of resignation, he gave in and agreed to take the safer route. Caroline let out a soft breath of relief and gave a small nod as the two of them continued forward. Elsewhere, deeper in the cave system, the rest of the group continued moving through the winding tunnels. Time was passing, and the longer they went without finding Jake and Caroline, the more anxious everyone became. Joanna finally spoke up, voicing her concern for the two missing teammates. Her voice was tight with worry, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong. Casper, trying to keep things calm, reminded her that Jake was with Caroline. Between the two of them, they'd be able to handle any beasts they encountered. He pointed out that the bigger challenge right now was the layout of the cave itself. The winding, branching paths were hard to navigate, and even with his high perception stat, he was having trouble seeing more than a few meters ahead. Bertram glanced at the others and said that if they didn't find Jake and Caroline soon, they might need to think about setting up camp. It was getting late, and they would only get more tired and vulnerable the longer they wandered in the dark. But Adam wasn't ready to give up. He insisted they keep moving, keep searching, until they had real reason to believe the others were safe. It seemed as though to him, stopping wasn't an option. Not while there was still a chance they were close. Bertram stopped Adam as he tried to push further into the dark, pointing out that they could continue the search first thing in the morning. He brought up Joanna, whose leg was gone as she was battling to stay upright, looking like she was in no shape to continue, and asked Adam to consider her condition. Joanna, clearly not wanting to be a burden, tried to insist that she was fine, but Adam didn't want to stop. Not yet. Not until he was sure the rest of the group was safe. He raised his torch higher, scanning the path ahead. That's when Casper paused, his posture stiffening as he said he heard something. He asked if anyone else had caught the sound. Adam immediately told everyone to stay silent. The group crouched low, tense, bracing for whatever might be approaching. Adam took a step forward with the torch, his eyes locked on the growing darkness ahead. The cave around them seemed to close in tighter with every breath, and the air grew heavier with each second. Bertram leaned toward Casper, trying to get his attention and asking if he could make anything out. But Casper, squinting into the pitch black, said the darkness was too thick. Even his vision, normally sharp, couldn't cut through it. The cave was alive with strange echoes, and the noises were starting to rattle even Adam, whose face showed signs of nervous tension as he strained to see through the void. Still, Casper picked up on something. Whatever was coming, it was getting closer, fast. His instincts kicked in and he warned the group, readying himself even though he still couldn't make out the exact shape. But then something shifted in his eyes. Recognition. He told the others to hold on. A moment later, Adam called out into the dark. And from the shadows, Caroline and Jake emerged. Relief swept through the group. Caroline ran straight to Adam, clearly overwhelmed to see them again after being separated. Jake followed behind, quieter but equally relieved. Bertram immediately moved toward them, asking if they had faced any trouble. Jake looked like he was about to answer, but Caroline jumped in first, saying everything was fine. Just a long walk, nothing more. Jake nodded quickly, letting her version stand without any challenge. Caroline then asked if they could find a better cave to spend the night. one that felt safer, less likely to collapse. But before anyone could respond, Joanna shrieked in surprise. She had spotted a spider and struck it down with her staff. Embarrassed, she apologized for the sudden noise. Casper frowned and made a quiet comment about the unnecessary violence towards spiders. He picked up the one she had hit, examining it with something close to admiration. He said it was harmless and important, and made it clear he didn't think it deserved to die. He turned and walked toward the edge of the cave to let it go somewhere safer, a place out of their path. But the moment he released it, he noticed something strange. More spiders were crawling out from nearby, appearing in clusters, dropping from the ceiling in small but growing numbers. He speculated that there could be a nest nearby. Jake saw this and suggested they move quickly before the situation got worse. But Casper, still calm, told them not to panic. He explained that spiders were rarely a threat to humans. He didn't see the one behind him. As he turned to speak to the group, distracted and unaware, a spider crept up along the wall behind him. Adam noticed it too late. He called out and rushed forward, but before he could reach him, the spider latched onto Casper's neck and bit down hard. Casper froze. Jake's hands moved on instinct, raising his bow as more spiders began descending from the cave ceiling. In seconds, they were surrounded, boxed in. There was no escape route. The air grew tight with the sound of skittering legs. Joanna, rattled, asked what they were supposed to do now. Her voice trembled. Casper, still standing, looked down at his hands and legs. He tried to move, but nothing responded. Panic set in as he looked to the others, barely holding back tears. He told them he couldn't move. Paralysis was setting in fast. Then, in the darkness ahead, something moved. Eyes. Dozens of them. Red and unblinking. Jake stared ahead. His expression shifted from focused to alarmed. Something massive was emerging. A huge yellow spider nearly the size of a house crawled out from the shadows. Its body was grotesque, bloated, and covered in fine hair. Its legs scraped against the stone with a dry hiss, and its face was twisted with clear hostility. There was no question now, this wasn't just a cave. They had walked into a nest. The enormous spider towered over the group, its legs twitching and ready to strike. Everyone braced themselves for what would be a desperate fight, everyone except Casper, who was still frozen in place. The venom from one of the smaller spiders had left him paralyzed, and now he could do nothing but call out in fear, begging for help from the others. That's when it happened. An arrow flew through the air and struck the spider right in its open mouth. Its cry echoed through the cave as blood sprayed out. The shot gave Adam just enough of a window to act. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward Casper, grabbed him by the arm, and slung him over his back. He yelled for everyone to run. Jake stayed behind, readying another arrow. Adam handed Casper off to Bertram in passing, then took a quick glance back just as Jake let the arrow fly. But the giant creature, a level 13 mammoth spider, barely flinched. It deflected the shot like it was nothing. While the others took off running, Jake stood his ground. A smile crept across his face as he faced the towering beast alone. Behind him, the rest of the group scrambled to escape. Caroline helped Joanna along, still burdened by her missing leg. Adam and Bertram ran ahead, Bertram shouting that they needed to get out immediately. Adam called out to Jake, urging him to retreat, but Jake didn't move. He didn't want to waste what he saw as a rare chance. Instead of fleeing, he charged the massive spider head on with his blade drawn. The creature lunged, but Jake dodged and slashed with surprising ease. He even managed to drive the blade into its belly, tearing into it with wild energy. But the momentum didn't last. The spider retaliated, landing a hit that sent Jake flying across the cave. He crashed into a stone wall with a force that made the entire cavern tremble. The ceiling groaned, loose rocks already starting to fall. Caroline cried out that they couldn't wait for him, that Adam needed to get out and save himself. But Adam refused. He wasn't about to abandon anyone, not even someone as reckless as Jake. Jake slowly got back up, breathing heavily but acting like the blow hadn't fazed him. He stood tall, even as the cave continued to crumble around him. Something inside him stirred, a pressure he'd only felt once before. A system window materialized in front of his eyes. The message was clear, the bloodline of the primal hunter had been awakened. He didn't fully understand what it meant, but he felt the difference. His senses sharpened, his instincts locked in. A red aura began to form around him as he grabbed at an arrow and dagger, preparing for one final stand. Stones rained down from the ceiling, but Jake didn't flinch. He wasn't going to run, he was going to fight. The spider lunged again. Jake met it head-on, dodging and countering. Every movement seemed calculated. The primal instincts guided him. It was like he could feel each strike before it came, responding with a kind of clarity he had never experienced before. He thought of what Caroline had said about how they weren't playing a game, that this was survival. But for Jake, the goal had changed. Survival wasn't enough. He wanted strength and nothing else mattered more. Adam watched, panicked. The cave was collapsing and they were running out of time, but Jake wouldn't stop. He was locked in, consumed by the fight. There was no reaching him. Jake didn't care. In that moment, he was in his element. He ducked and rolled, clashed and countered, each move more precise than the last. Then, just as Jake closed his eyes to strike with his dagger, he felt a hand attempt to grip him from behind. Before he could think it through, that hand was nearly sliced off by Jake's blade. But after the first strike, Jake saw it wasn't the spider. It was Adam. Adam had charged in, injured but determined. He pulled Jake back, desperate to drag him out. He shouted that throwing his life away like this wasn't the answer. Something about that finally clicked. Jake paused. For the first time in minutes, he hesitated, and then he relented. Together, they stumbled toward the exit as the cavern gave way behind them. The spider tried to follow, but the collapsing tunnel trapped it inside. The dust filled the air, rocks sealed the path, and the roar of the beast faded beneath the rubble. Outside, the group huddled in shock. Joanna frantically looked around and began to panic, unsure if Jake and Adam had made it out alive. No one answered right away. Then, they finally emerged from the collapsed cave, pushing past the smoke of the debris. The sunlight hit their faces for the first time in what felt like hours. They had made it out. The unstable cave, packed with deadly magical beasts, was now behind them. The rest of the group had already gathered outside. It didn't take long before Caroline noticed the blood trailing down Adam's side. Her expression shifted the moment Jake explained that he had accidentally cut Adam while fighting what he believed was another spider. Caroline's face hardened. She questioned why Jake would even keep fighting after everything they had just been through. The anger in her voice made it clear that, to her, this wasn't just another mistake. Before things could escalate, Adam stepped in. He brushed it off, saying he was fine, but not everyone agreed. Bertram cut in, his tone sharp. For him, Jake's recklessness was one thing, but injuring a teammate crossed a line. Even if Jake had a reason, Bertram made it clear he wasn't ready to let it go. Adam, trying to de-escalate, insisted it was just a scratch and asked Caroline to patch it up. She nodded, saying she could manage the healing, but Bertram wasn't finished. He turned his attention back to Jake and called out his behavior, claiming that Jake was the biggest liability to their team. He said it plainly that the group couldn't keep functioning if they were always worried about whether Jake would lose control or push things too far. Jake stood there, quiet. The words sank deeper than he expected. He began to wonder if that was really how they saw him all along. Not just unpredictable, but dangerous. Caroline's earlier words echoed in his mind. The way she said they hadn't asked to become killers. She thought he was just some mindless brute who'd lost sight of what they were trying to survive for. Bertram continued, saying that as Adam's friend, he had to point out the truth. Adam's life would only get harder if Jake kept acting with no regard for the group's safety. His actions weren't just mistakes anymore. They were selfish, careless, and eventually, they'd come at a price. Jake didn't speak, but inside he was unraveling. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was the real threat to their survival. A burden they were being forced to carry. Or maybe they were the problem. Maybe they were the ones slowing him down. His thoughts turned bitter. He started remembering. He remembered how Joanna had passed out from the pain, how his concern for her pulled his focus at the worst possible moment. That hesitation nearly got him killed. He remembered Caroline. He had gone back to rescue her and ended up cut off from the others, nearly trapped. He remembered Adam stepping in, holding him back. If Adam hadn't interfered, the spider would have died. Jake would have gained experience, leveled up, and become stronger. But that moment was taken from him. As all these memories played back in his mind, he continued to contemplate. But then, as if solely just to rip him from his thoughts, he heard something close by. A faint rustle from the bushes just ahead. He raised his bow and pulled an arrow into place. His voice cut through the forest, as he demanded to know who was hiding in the brush nearby. The air grew heavy with tension as a tall, muscular figure emerged from the trees, sword in hand. His presence was immediately intimidating, not just because of his size, but the way he moved like someone used to being obeyed. He introduced himself as Richard and explained that he had come to investigate the noise from the rockfall. According to him, he meant no harm, but his calm voice didn't match the way everyone felt. His group, much larger and more imposing, stood just behind him in the trees. Jake kept his arrow trained on the man, glancing over at Adam, waiting for a signal. Adam stepped forward and tried to defuse the situation, introducing their group and making it clear they weren't looking for trouble. But Jake remained on edge. Something about the way Richard smiled didn't sit right with him, and he couldn't ignore how large and well-equipped the other group seemed. Richard acknowledged their hesitation. He said he understood their caution but insisted that joining forces would be in everyone's best interest. He spoke of survival, of unity, and how his group had already merged with two others. His tone was friendly, cooperative even, but Jake couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him, especially when a blonde guy standing in Richard's ranks locked eyes with him and grinned. There was no warmth in it, only something smug and calculated. That discomfort only grew when Richard's gaze shifted toward Caroline. She had instinctively moved closer to Adam, holding his arm tightly. Richard noticed. It didn't take him long to figure out that she was a healer, and once he realized that, the mood shifted. He said his group had recently lost their own healer. Without potions or recovery skills, they were vulnerable. He didn't hide that they were interested in Caroline specifically. His words were wrapped in politeness, but the implication was sharp. They didn't need the whole group, only her. Jake's thoughts spiraled as he tried to process what was happening. Caroline was vital to their survival. Without her, they wouldn't have made it this far. Richard made it sound like a request, but everyone heard what it really was. It was a warning. Adam asked what would happen if Caroline said no. The smile vanished from Richard's face. He laughed, not out of amusement, but in that way people do when they're no longer pretending. The threat was clear. One way or another, he planned to take her. Jake felt the pressure closing in. Their group was tired, their stamina drained. He might have been the only one who could still fight, but even then, the odds were impossible. Maybe he could take one or two by surprise, but with how many Richard had behind him, they wouldn't last long. He kept scanning around, trying to think of something, anything, that could shift the balance. Richard kept talking, trying to sound reasonable again. He said they wouldn't hurt her, just needed her help. Jake could hear the lie in every word. He didn't believe for a second that Caroline would be safe in their hands, but escape seemed impossible. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and tired. Adam stepped closer to Jake and placed a hand on his shoulder. He said maybe joining them wasn't such a bad idea. At least it would prevent a fight they couldn't win. Joanna immediately objected. She said she didn't trust Richard. She couldn't explain it, but she knew something was wrong. Casper, trying to keep the peace, pointed out that maybe Richard's group was just desperate. Maybe they could be reasoned with. Adam then turned to Caroline and asked what she wanted to do. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She didn't want to fight, she just wanted this to end. If going with Richard's group would keep things peaceful, then she was willing to do it. Her words hit hard. Nobody wanted to let her go. But the reality of their situation made the choice feel impossible. And slowly, the group seemed to be leaning toward surrender. Not because they agreed, but because they were out of options. Jake stood frozen. He could see Caroline's hands trembling. Her decision wasn't made out of willingness. It was made out of fear. And if they went with Richard, Jake was convinced things would only get worse. Just as Adam began to finalize the agreement, Jake suddenly stepped forward. He called out to Richard and asked a simple question: what level was he? The air stilled. Richard, slightly confused but still composed, replied that he was at level 9, with several others in his group at 7 or higher. He followed up by asking who Jake was supposed to be. Jake grinned. The sarcasm in his voice was thick as he introduced himself with mockery, saying he was someone Richard could go screw himself over. The mood shifted instantly. Tension spiked. Adam turned toward Jake, confused and anxious, asking what he was doing. Richard was no longer smiling. He said they had almost reached a peaceful understanding, but Jake interrupted him, saying not to worry about the others. They could go, join Richard's group if that's what they wanted, but Jake wouldn't be joining them. He said he had bigger prey to hunt. He told Richard that from this moment on, his group was under Richard's care. That if anything happened to them, there would be consequences. Richard narrowed his eyes and asked if Jake was being serious. Jake still smiled as he asked Richard a question of his own. Did he really think he was the predator here? He gestured toward the trees and asked just how fast Richard thought his archers were. Were they faster than Jakey? Faster than someone like him? The threat hung in the air. The message was clear. Jake let Richard know that he could easily take his head off if he wanted to. One of the archers standing behind Richard immediately began to ready his bow. Tension filled the air. Richard, who had kept a smug composure until now, suddenly realized Jake wasn't bluffing. Jake didn't take his eyes off him. He made it clear that he would be watching closely. Richard didn't argue. Instead, he called over the blonde guy from his group. The two leaned in and began whispering quietly to each other. Jake watched them for a moment, then turned inward, running through the risks in his mind. He figured Caroline would be safer staying with Richard's team. They needed a healer, and as long as Caroline felt respected and useful, they would have no reason to hurt her or the others. Keeping her alive meant keeping their own team strong. It wasn't a perfect plan. He knew there was still a chance Richard would act out eventually, but at the very least, the threat he just issued would force the guy to think twice before making any bold moves. That was the best Jake could hope for. He had to believe it would be enough. As he turned to leave, Adam called out to him. His voice was filled with concern. Before Jake could respond, Casper stepped in, grabbing his shoulder, clearly shaken. He asked Jake if he was seriously planning to leave them. Jake smiled, calm and sure of himself. He confirmed that he was. He said he had his own reasons for going through this tutorial, his own path to follow. The others, he argued, stood a better chance of surviving by sticking with Richard's group. As long as Caroline stayed important to them, everyone would be protected. He promised to keep an eye on things from a distance. he wouldn't be far. Just as Jake was about to go, Adam reached into his pocket and pulled out a few potions. He handed them over with a firm look and called Jake a friend. There was nothing else to say. Jake took the potions, gave a nod of gratitude, and thanked him. Then he turned and walked away. As he disappeared into the forest, the blonde guy from Richard's group watched him closely. His eyes had a desire for action, and for a second, it looked like he was about to do something. Maybe follow, maybe even attack. But Richard stopped him. Whatever was on the blonde's mind, Richard gave him a firm signal not to act. The moment passed. Then Richard glanced over at the archer in his party. The man nodded and gave a strange smile, not one of amusement or agreement, but something colder. A smile that hinted at something else. The forest was quiet, but the tension in the air was anything but. The faction of Richard's group moved with reckless abandon. They had their orders, and the task was clear. They needed to find Jake and take care of him. Just like Richard wanted. At the front of the group was one of Richard's men, an archer, who couldn't stop complaining. He muttered bitterly about how this could have all been avoided if he had simply dealt with Jake earlier. It felt ridiculous to him that they were now wasting time tracking someone who should have been eliminated long ago. Another member of the group spoke up, suggesting that Jake was probably weak, probably not even at level 5. The archer agreed. If that was the case, then there shouldn't be any issue. Finishing Jake off would be easy. But before they could make any kind of move, the forest answered them. 2 arrows came out of nowhere, both slamming into the eyes of one of the men, and the group froze in place as the body hit the ground. Panic rose instantly. The archer at the front immediately went into high alert, eyes scanning the dense green around them. But he couldn't see anything. Just leaves and shadows. Then came another arrow, this one lodging deep into the throat of another teammate. Blood spilled from his mouth as he crumpled to the floor with a wet gurgle. And now the forest didn't feel quiet anymore, it felt predatory, as if it were alive. The 3 that remained didn't wait to think. They turned and ran, sprinting blindly through the underbrush with no sense of direction, only the desperate instinct to survive. They ran until their legs burned, and eventually they slowed down, gasping for breath. For a brief moment, they thought the danger had passed. But the forest shifted again. A bush rustled nearby, and the archer raised his hand, pointing toward it. He ordered one of the others to go check. The man nodded and approached the bush with caution. There was nothing inside, just branches and leaves. He relaxed for a second too soon. Jake emerged silently from behind, eyes glowing faintly, a sinister grin creeping across his face. Without a word or hesitation, he slit the man's throat. The sound was barely louder than the wind. The archer reacted fast and let an arrow fly. It struck Jake at his side, but something was wrong. Jake didn't scream or stagger. He reached down, pulled the arrow out like it was a splinter, and looked up with blood-red eyes that seemed to pulse with violent energy. There was no pain in his expression, only enjoyment. Another 2 arrows were fired in desperation. Jake rolled under them effortlessly. They hit a nearby tree, harmless. He stood again, slow and calm, as if nothing in the world could touch him. Jake pulled out an arrow and launched it back toward the archer. It veered wide and missed. Or so it seemed. The arrow struck a branch overhead, snapping it loose. It fell toward the archer, nearly striking him. He managed to bat it away with his bow. But by the time he looked back, Jake was no longer in sight. The forest around him felt still, but only for a second. Jake appeared behind him. There was no warning. A sharp pain tore through the archer's back, and he collapsed forward onto the dirt. His breathing grew shallow. Jake had already moved on. Still smiling, Jake tilted his head, listening. He said he could hear someone else nearby. A woman stepped out from behind a tree, barely holding herself upright. Her hands trembled as she raised her weapon, but her grip was weak. She was terrified. Her entire body screamed with fear, and her voice shook as she tried to beg for mercy. Jake looked at her. His red eyes gleamed darker, deeper. The primal hunter inside him was in full control now. He took a single step forward, and before the scene could unfold any further, the perspective shifted away. Elsewhere in the forest, the combined group of Richard's main party and Adam's team continued their journey together. The smaller strike team Richard had sent after Jake was no longer with them, and their absence went unnoticed for now. As they walked, Richard broke the silence. He brought up Jake, asking casually about the archer who had just parted ways with them. He made it sound like an offhand comment, but there was a curiosity behind it. Adam answered without much concern. Jake wasn't just some stranger, they had worked together back in the real world. Just co-workers before all of this had started. Richard didn't seem entirely convinced. He pointed out how Jake and Adam seemed unusually close. Adam shrugged off the implication and said it was just natural. As the office manager, it was part of his job to look out for his team. Old habits didn't die just because the world had changed. Richard smiled and placed a hand on Adam's shoulder. He praised him, calling it a respectable mindset. Then he reassured Adam that he wasn't a threat. He admitted that things had gotten a little tense earlier, but insisted he didn't want any of Adam's people to suffer. To make his point, Richard gave Adam a friendly bump on the chest, as if sealing an agreement between them. He promised that in his camp, nobody from Adam's group would be harmed. They were all in this together now, and cooperation was the only way to make it out alive. According to Richard, survival required unity. And that was a fact. As they continued their journey, Adam turned to Richard with some confusion, asking about the camp. It seemed he hadn't realized that their destination was more than just a simple checkpoint. Richard gave him a look of mild amusement and explained that this wasn't just a random location in the forest. He and his people had built something. A base. A proper one. And as of now, they had officially arrived. What stood before them was more than anyone in Adam's group had expected. It was a growing camp, clearly expanding by the day. The layout was organized with several tents, makeshift wooden structures, and defensive barricades already in place. For a place built in the chaos of the tutorial, it was impressive. Caroline looked around and made a quiet comment about how surprisingly nice and well put together it all was. Bertram nodded, clearly impressed himself. Even he had to admit it was a lot better than he anticipated. Casper, meanwhile, was distracted. A girl from the camp waved in their direction, and he turned red almost instantly. As the rest of the group looked around, he muttered that the place was perfect. It was hard to tell if he was referring to the camp or the girl. Adam glanced toward Caroline and asked for her thoughts on it all. She looked around and gave a light response, saying that it might not be a 5-star hotel, but compared to the dark, damp cave they had originally planned to camp in, this was paradise. Richard gestured for them to follow him deeper into the camp. He walked with confidence and assured them that someone from his group would guide them to their sleeping quarters. They were welcome to settle in, relax, and get comfortable. For now, this was their new home. Before anyone could reply, a strange sound echoed through the camp. A faint noise at first, but it grew louder and sharper with each passing second. Everyone froze for a moment, trying to make sense of it. The unease in the air was immediate. Casper asked nervously if anyone else had heard it, but before he got an answer, someone came running toward them. A girl. Her face pale, her movements frantic. She looked like she had seen something terrible. Her steps were heavy, desperate, and it was clear from the panic in her eyes that something had gone very wrong. Richard's expression shifted instantly. The calm confidence he usually carried was gone. He called for the guards, already bracing for the worst. The blonde boy from earlier, the one who had nearly attacked Jake, responded instinctively. His hands moved to prepare magic. Eyes locked on the newcomer. Adam watched the scene, tense, his eyes darting between the guards and the approaching girl. One of the guards raised a hand and shouted for everyone to wait. He pointed out that the person running toward them wasn't a stranger. She was one of their own. Now close enough to see clearly, the girl ran up to Richard, breathless, shaking, and clearly disturbed. Her voice broke as she called out to him, and even though she was still trying to catch her breath, it was obvious she was in a state of shock. Richard demanded answers. He wanted to know where Nicholas was. He asked what had happened to the team she had gone out with. He didn't know it yet, but the very squad he had sent after Jake had been wiped out. The girl, still gasping for breath, gave him the truth. Everyone was dead. Her voice cracked when she said it, but the message was clear. The entire team had been killed. Richard's face shifted from confusion to anger. Immediately, his mind went to betrayal. He asked if Nicholas had turned on them, if someone from inside the group had turned traitor. But the girl quickly clarified that Nicholas was dead too. His patience was wearing thin now. The idea of betrayal was bad enough, but hearing that Nicholas, one of his most capable men, had fallen, made things worse. He demanded an explanation. The girl's reply only deepened the tension. She said it was Jake, the archer, the one they had underestimated. Richard's expression twisted into something dark. He couldn't believe it. It didn't make sense. He wanted to know how Jake had managed to kill everyone. Why was she the only one left? Why had he let her live? The girl's hands trembled as she explained that Jake had spared her only to send a message. He wanted Richard to know that Nicholas had fought well, and he wanted Richard to understand that the warning he had given before wasn't just words. He had meant every part of it. Richard, still furious, stepped forward and grabbed the girl roughly. His voice was sharp as he pressed her for more. He didn't care about excuses or shock. He wanted every detail. He needed to understand what had just happened or who Jake had become. She flinched but spoke. Her voice quivered. Jake hadn't fought like someone defending himself. He had enjoyed it. There was something wrong with him and he wasn't normal. He was dangerous, beyond what they had believed. She told Richard plainly that Jake wasn't just another survivor. He was something else entirely, a predatory monster. Jake moved through the dense forest with slow, heavy steps, his thoughts stuck on what to do next. He was drained, both mentally and physically, and knew he needed to find a safe place to rest. The chaos of the night before had left him with little time to breathe, and now that the forest had quieted, he finally had a moment to go through his system notifications. Scrolling through them, he saw the logs of his recent kills. One of them was a level 6 medium warrior. That fight had earned him 365 XP. Another entry confirmed the death of a level 9 human archer. As he kept reading, he realized he had already hit level 7 in the archer class. That caught him off guard. The fights had come so fast that he hadn't stopped to consider how much he had progressed. The level up gave him 3 unassigned stat points. He considered where to put them, thinking about his current condition. Vitality and endurance were both tempting, especially given how vulnerable he was now. Alone in the forest, with the temperature dropping and the sun fading, any wrong move could cost him. Still, he couldn't help but consider adding points to his perception. The synergy between that and perception had become more obvious after his earlier fights. He remembered the edge it had given him in those split-second moments. In the end, he committed all 3 points to perception, hoping that extra awareness would help him survive whatever came next. He opened his status window and saw that his health was dangerously low. Less than a third of his HP remained. He thought back to the arrow that had pierced him during the fight with the enemy archer. That one mistake had brought him closer to death than he liked to admit. Caroline was no longer there to back him up. That meant he had to be more careful. Potions were limited, and reckless choices were no longer an option. His thoughts were interrupted when several wolves began creeping out of the shadows around him. He realized instantly that the timing couldn't have been worse. The scene shifted to the camp. Caroline was quietly setting up her tent. Her hands moved with the same precision she always showed, focused on the task. Then the blonde guy from earlier walked up to her. He seemed unsure of himself, hesitating before he spoke. He asked if she was Caroline, and she acknowledged him. She also pointed out that he was one of Richard's fighters. The guy scratched the back of his head and tried to explain himself. He didn't want to be lumped in with the rest of the group or come across as aggressive. He introduced himself as William and admitted he was only 19. Much younger than most of the others. That was part of why he had put on such an act. He said no one would respect him if they saw him as just a teenager, so he tried to act tougher than he was. He admitted that it was all for show. He wasn't dangerous. He was just trying to survive. Caroline, hearing that, offered him some reassurance. She told him she understood. He was just another person trying to get through the madness like everyone else. Her voice was calm and kind. But as she turned away, William's expression changed. The awkward smile dropped. What replaced it was something cold and sinister. Back in the forest, the ground was covered with the lifeless bodies of wolves. The area was still, almost peaceful. A bunny nibbled quietly on a patch of flora near the corpses. Then Jake suddenly woke up, and the animal darted away in fright. Jake sat up, startled. He looked around and tried to guess how long he had been asleep. The sky had already shifted. It was morning. He pushed himself to his feet and started brushing himself off. The rest hadn't been long enough, but it would have to do. He told himself that time was running out. There were still more threats ahead, and he needed to be ready. As he spoke to himself, the reality hit him again. He was alone now, no backup, no support, just his skills and instincts to carry him forward. He went out and began hunting. First, he caught a rabbit. Then he kept going, picking off animals one by one. A bird, a wild boar, even a strange, gray lion-like beast that prowled near the edge of a clearing. Each hunt pushed him further. Each kill gave him more experience. By the end of it, Jake had reached level 10. For just one day of work, it wasn't a bad outcome. As Jake continued moving through the forest, he spotted a faint light coming from a tree. He paused and tried to figure out what kind of light it was. Suspicion crossed his mind. It could have been a trap. He knocked on the tree a few times to test that theory, but nothing seemed off. It didn't feel dangerous, just unusual. That was enough for him to climb up and investigate further. From a distance, he noticed something tucked away in the tree's upper branches. It turned out to be a small, mysterious box. When he got closer and picked it up, the system provided a description. It was an uncommon magical jeweled lockbox created by the system itself. The message said it contained a rare and powerful item. He didn't waste any more time thinking about it. He opened the box, eager to see what was inside. What he found, though, surprised him. It was just a pair of leather bracers labeled as the bracers of the novice rogue. The description mentioned they were designed for new initiates of an organization called the Order of Umbra. According to the system, the bracers could self-repair and granted 5 points of agility and 3 points of strength. They also boosted the effectiveness of all stealth-related skills. Jake didn't understand what the Order of Umbra was, and it left him puzzled. Still, he couldn't deny how valuable the stats were. Those kinds of boosts were far from ordinary, especially for something labeled as a novice item. He decided to equip the bracers immediately. Inside the box there was something else tucked beside the bracers. It was a separate item called a tutorial equipment upgrade token. The description said it could be used to transform any basic starter item from the tutorial into one of common rarity. That opened up a few options. He thought about upgrading his bow first, but the more he thought about it, the more he hesitated. The bow already felt strong and reliable. There didn't seem to be any urgent need to change it. Then he glanced down at his cloak. It was torn and soaked with dried blood from the earlier fights. Compared to the bow, the cloak looked like it had been through a war. He figured that upgrading the cloak might be the smarter move. He used the token, and as soon as he did, the fabric began regenerating on its own. A blue system notification confirmed the update. The cloak was now a common archer cloak, equipped with a slashing resistance and the same kind of self-repairing enchantment the bracers had. Jake thought it was a great outcome. The cloak might not be as flashy as the bracers, but having gear that could fix itself was already a major upgrade. After climbing back down from the tree, his mind went straight to the possibilities. If that kind of box was just sitting there, what else might be hidden in the forest? He believed there were probably more boxes like that scattered around, tucked away in places most people wouldn't even think to look. Hard-to-reach areas might have even rarer items. And that thought stuck with him. He remembered the giant cave spider again. That thing had been the strongest monster he had fought so far, a level 13 threat. In his mind, that made it the kind of creature that might have been guarding something important. But the rockfall had closed off that path completely. There was no going back now. As he moved through the underbrush, he looked over a nearby cliff and began wondering if there might be another cave out there. He kept walking for a few hours and eventually stumbled upon one. It looked different from the first. This one didn't give off any immediate signs of danger. He didn't sense any nearby monsters or threats. What he did feel, though, was something else. There was a strong sense that something valuable was waiting inside. The feeling was enough to make him smile. With a torch in hand, he stepped inside and started to explore. The cave had a faint blue glow that caught his attention. He looked down and saw glowing mushrooms on the floor, giving the entire area a strange, dim light. He pressed forward until he reached an old, rotting door. The wooden sections looked like they had been untouched for a long time. That made him wonder how long it had been sitting there. Then the system interrupted his thoughts. A blue window popped up, stating that a new challenge dungeon had been discovered. Another message followed listing the entry requirements. The system said he had to be below level 10 in both class and race, not have a profession, and be ranked in the top 5% of survivors by tutorial points. He met all the conditions. That meant he was now confirmed to be among the top 5% of participants in the tutorial. A final system message appeared with a choice. He could accept or refuse the challenge. Standing there in front of the door, Jake looked at the screen and considered his options. But the decision didn't take long. With everything in front of him, he couldn't see any reason to turn down something like this. Jake entered the dungeon and immediately noticed how different it was from the outside. Blue glowing mushrooms were everywhere, scattered along the cave corridor in such large numbers that they lit up the entire space. The strange sight made him wonder what kind of place he had just stepped into. A blue system window popped up in front of him, displaying his objective. It stated clearly that the only way to complete this dungeon was to survive until the end by overcoming all the challenges that would be presented. Failure would result in death. Jake didn't look particularly excited about that mission. There was a hint of doubt in the way he processed the information. But then he noticed something new hanging from his neck. It was a red jewel, and a notification appeared identifying it as the necklace of holding. The system said it had been granted to whoever entered the challenge dungeon and allowed the user to store certain items found inside. He figured it was some kind of storage space. It made him wonder if the necklace was connected to the kind of challenges he would be facing. Before he could think more about it, the necklace started to glow and vibrate. That made him pause. Something strange was happening. He wondered if there was something inside the necklace. Then, without warning, a strange blue creature appeared in front of him. It let out a low growl. Jake had no idea what it was. He immediately reached for his sword, but when he tried to draw it, he realized it wasn't there. He had no idea where it had gone. The small blue creature with tiny wings began to attack him, but Jake didn't move. He stood completely still, watching it try to do damage. It kept attacking him over and over, but nothing worked. He didn't even flinch. He called the thing pathetic for its failed attempts, and that clearly struck a nerve with the creature. The monster snapped back, claiming it would show Jake who the real pathetic one was. What caught Jake off guard wasn't the threat itself, but the fact that the creature could talk. That was what finally made him nervous. In that distracted moment, Jake accidentally stepped on a hidden mechanism inside the cave. A trap was triggered, and a sharp projectile was launched out of a hole at high speed. Jake dodged it just in time. He realized now that it was a trap and not just a random attack. The projectile was powerful. When it hit the stone, it cracked the area and got embedded deep into it. Green liquid started leaking out of it and began corroding the surface. That told Jake everything he needed to know. Getting hit by that would have been a serious problem. The small creature started laughing, clearly amused by what had just happened. Jake looked at the projectile still stuck in the stone and asked if the monster had led him into some kind of death trap. The creature responded with sarcasm, acting like it had no idea and claimed it was just a fool who got trapped in some necklace. Jake asked if someone had actually trapped the thing in there. Before the conversation could continue, another trap was triggered and another projectile shot out. The creature pointed out that Jake had more pressing matters to deal with, and he was right. Jake barely avoided the next trap and realized he couldn't afford to keep getting distracted. Trying to catch his breath, Jake refocused. The only thing that mattered now was getting through the corridor without getting hit. He needed to make it to the other side. He started running, pushing himself to move fast. Trap after trap was triggered as he moved, but he managed to weave and dodge every single one. With quick reactions and full focus, he avoided all the projectiles. After a few intense seconds, he finally reached the end of the corridor unharmed. He paused to catch his breath while the monster commented that it wasn't a bad escape. Jake then asked if the little creature planned to follow him around everywhere. The creature responded with irony, saying that it didn't exactly have any other place to go. And while Jake looked slightly annoyed, he didn't argue much. He simply continued forward. Jake reached another section of the cave where a massive rock wall stretched high above him. At the very top was a door, likely the exit, but the only way up seemed to be through a series of half-transparent, floating platforms embedded into the wall. It was clear that this part of the dungeon was about vertical movement. A new system notification appeared in front of him. It stated that the objective here was to collect 5 silver mushrooms. From the looks of it, they were located across some of those floating platforms. He started to wonder if this was what the necklace of holding was meant for, to safely store these mushrooms as he collected them. Inspecting the rock wall more closely, Jake noticed several large holes placed in predictable patterns along the walls near the platforms. He pointed out that they were obvious enough that even someone without a high perception stat would be able to notice them. He suspected these were where the acid spike traps would launch from once he got close to the mushrooms. The small blue creature beside him, who had been observing quietly, commented that maybe Jake could use the placement of those holes to calculate the angles of incoming projectiles. If he did that, he might be able to plan a route that kept his exposure to a minimum. Jake acknowledged that this could work, but dismissed it right away, saying it wouldn't be any fun to do it that way. Instead, he launched straight into the climb, leaping from platform to platform while triggering one trap after another. Acid spikes flew at him, but he dodged every single one with ease, relying on his high speed and the boost from his bloodline ability. As he moved, he made sure to collect each mushroom he came across, tossing them quickly into the necklace storage as he advanced. Cecil, the blue creature, started to look more and more impressed. Jake was moving so quickly and efficiently that there was only one mushroom left. But then, during a moment of distraction, Cecil didn't notice one of the traps being triggered. A projectile launched toward him, and he froze in place, cursing as he realized he was in danger and unable to dodge in time. Jake saw what was happening and reacted instantly. He sprinted toward the blue imp, grabbing him and moving them both out of the projectile's path. The spike hit the area behind them, but they were safe. Together, they reached the final platform and made it to the top of the rock wall. Cecil, still catching his breath, admitted that he owed Jake for saving his life. But Jake wasn't interested in gratitude. He immediately snapped at the little creature, demanding to know what was wrong with him and why he had gotten distracted enough to almost die. The imp explained that he had been trapped inside the necklace for a long time and wasn't as agile or sharp as he used to be. That seemed to calm Jake down a bit. He asked the creature what he was, and the blue imp introduced himself as Cecil. Jake gave his name in return, calling himself Jake. He then asked Cecil who had sealed him inside the necklace, but the imp refused to say, brushing it off as a long story he didn't want to talk about. Cecil also apologized, assuming Jake hadn't managed to collect the final mushroom because he had stopped to save him. But Jake revealed that he had, in fact, gotten all 5. He held them up as proof. Cecil was shocked. Not only had Jake saved him, but he still managed to grab the mushroom mid-rescue. He admitted that Jake was surprisingly good at this. Then, in typical Cecil fashion, he added that Jake was still an idiot for charging through a room filled with deadly traps without planning anything. A talented idiot, but an idiot nonetheless. Jake didn't argue. He just thanked him for the half-hearted compliment and moved forward. Eventually, they reached another room. This one was completely filled with a strange neon green liquid. Dozens of square stone platforms stuck out of the surface, each with differently colored boxes placed on top. A system message popped up explaining that the challenge now involved moving across 3 rooms using the platforms and that each room had a time limit of 15 minutes. Jake looked over the setup and assumed this would just be another platforming sequence. Jump from one to the next like he had already done before. He didn't think it sounded difficult at all, But then another system message appeared, almost as if reacting to his overconfidence. The difficulty spiked immediately. The message said that all of his stats had been reduced to 10 points, and all his skills had been deactivated. That hit him hard. He was stunned by the sudden change. The system clarified that his stats and skills would return after the challenge was over, but that didn't comfort him at all. For a moment, he just stood there. Then, visibly shaken, he dropped to his knees on the rocky floor. The sudden weakness left him feeling powerless. He started to sweat, overwhelmed by the pressure. As he cursed and struggled to figure out what to do next, Jake remained on the ground for a moment, overwhelmed by how heavy his own equipment had become. With all his stats reduced, especially his strength, the gear that once felt manageable now weighed him down like dead weight. Even lifting himself back onto his feet felt like a struggle. It was almost as if the gravity around him had increased, pressing him harder into the stone floor. He opened his status window and saw exactly what he feared. Every stat had been dropped to 10. He was back to being nearly as weak as he had been before entering the tutorial. But despite this, his primal hunter bloodline was still active. That part of his status hadn't been disabled. He started to think about why that might be, wondering if the system didn't classify bloodline abilities the same way it did skills. It was a strange thought, and it left him with more questions about what his bloodline really was. While he was stuck in thought, Cecil asked if he was okay. Jake confirmed and apologized for spacing out. The imp seemed relieved but quickly reminded him that the clock was already ticking. The countdown had dropped to 13 minutes and 48 seconds. He needed to move. This time, unlike before, he knew brute speed wouldn't help him. He needed to figure out the room's mechanics and plan his way through. The objective was simple: make it across the room without falling into the neon green acid below. But the solution wasn't going to be straightforward. He looked more carefully at the platforms and noticed 3 distinct types, each marked with different symbols. The first showed a snake eating a mushroom. The second displayed a winged serpent surrounded by other creatures possibly being worshipped. The third featured a wyvern. He tried to make sense of it, wondering if this was meant to show a growth cycle of some kind. Cecil gave him credit for the observation and called it clever. But Jake admitted that even if it was some kind of progression or evolution, it didn't tell him how to cross safely. The imp made a sarcastic remark about humans lacking wings, which didn't help the situation. Still, Jake kept looking. He knew there had to be a solution here. After a bit more thinking, he picked up a silver mushroom from his inventory and threw it onto one of the platforms with the snake eating mushroom symbol. As he watched closely, the mushroom was absorbed by the platform. That was the clue he needed. Cecil realized what was happening as well. The symbols weren't just decoration, they were part of the puzzle. Some platforms required an offering of mushrooms to activate or become safe. The ones with snakes were the ones that could be triggered with mushrooms. The imp teased Jake a little for figuring it out, but Jake didn't mind. He had a working theory now. He trusted his instincts and believed the glowing platforms were the most dangerous. If he could deactivate that glow by feeding them mushrooms first, then jump afterward, he could make it across. Time was running out. The clock had dropped to 9 minutes and 21 seconds. Jake knew he couldn't hesitate any longer. He threw a mushroom onto another platform and, without waiting for confirmation, took the leap. He landed. The platform held steady beneath him. He wasn't dead. That was all he needed to know. Cecil actually smiled at the result, visibly glad that Jake had survived. But then the imp quickly caught himself and questioned why he even cared. There was no reason he should have been concerned about a human. Jake didn't slow down. He kept the momentum going, using the same method to disable more platforms before jumping. One by one, he made his way across the room, using mushrooms to secure each landing. Eventually, he reached the far end of the chamber and stood before the next door, breathing heavily but alive. He barely had time to process what just happened before another blue notification appeared. It told him to proceed through the next door. A fresh 15-minute countdown had already started. He realized there would be no time to rest. It didn't matter. He pushed the door open and saw that the next room had even more platforms. Just ahead, resting on a lone platform, was a strange-looking dagger. Jake stared at it, uncertain if it was actually a weapon. It looked more like it had been carved out of bone than forged from metal. He took it anyway, remarking to himself that it gave off an unsettling, cult-like vibe. With the dagger in hand, he turned to study the room again. There wasn't a clear route ahead like before. The platforms with snake symbols no longer formed a straight path. And with all his stats lowered, he knew there was no way he could make large jumps across long distances like he could before. The room was different now, and so was the strategy. He tightened his grip on the dagger and tried to think things through. If mushrooms deactivated the snake platforms, then maybe this new item was meant to interact with another type. He focused on the winged serpent symbols, wondering what those platforms might need. The symbol showed the creature surrounded by what looked like small figures that seemed like worshippers. That was the only clue he had. After a moment of hesitation, he did something risky. He used the dagger to slice open his palm and splashed blood onto one of the winged serpent platforms. The effect was immediate. The glow on the platform faded, indicating it had been deactivated. Cecil watched from behind and made a sarcastic comment about hoping humans had plenty of blood to give. Jake felt the pain from the cut more than he expected. Unlike tossing mushrooms, this method hurts. And even more concerning, the blood kept pouring out longer than it should have. He had only made a small cut, but it wouldn't stop bleeding. Cecil pointed out that there was now a clear path forward using those winged serpent platforms. According to him, Jake only had to make 3 more jumps to reach the other side. Jake looked down at his injured hand, the pain still pulsing through it. But he knew he didn't have a choice. He leapt to the first platform. He made the distance. But on landing, he slipped and hit the stone hard. When he lifted his hand again, he noticed that the area around the cut was starting to darken. Something wasn't right. That dagger had done more than just injure him. Still, there wasn't time to stop. He tossed more blood onto the next platform, already feeling the effects of blood loss. His body was getting weaker, and by now he could barely stay upright. He knew he had to keep moving. Lying down would only get him killed. With what strength he had left, he pushed off for another jump. Midair, an intense pain shot through his body. It wasn't just fatigue. Something was wrong at a deeper level. Even Cecil started to panic, wondering if Jake could really survive like this. Jake nearly plummeted straight into the acid. He barely managed to catch the edge of a cliff, holding on by one hand. And worse, the hand he was using was the same one he had cut earlier. The pain was unbearable. But he held on. Cecil rushed to try and help, reaching for Jake's arm to pull him up. But the little imp couldn't do much. Jake was too heavy and the situation too desperate. His foot dipped into the acid and began to dissolve almost instantly. The damage was real and fast, and there was nothing he could do about it. Hanging by one arm, his leg slowly destroyed and the acid seeming to creep closer, Jake was losing strength. He clung to the edge with everything he had left. His face said it all. He didn't think he was going to make it, and his fear was evident. The dread had set in. It felt like death was only a few seconds away. Jake's hands were still clinging to the ground, refusing to let go. His body felt like it was moments from shutting down completely. He couldn't end it like this. Dying alone in that place, he was reduced to nothing but air at the hands of a pool of acid as poison infiltrated his entire body. This wasn't how his story would end, he knew that much. Cecil kept pulling at his arm, trying to help, but the imp's small frame was no match for the weight of a human adult. Still, Jake didn't blame him. He started to claw his way forward, digging into the ground, trying to haul himself out of this mess with what little strength he had left. He told the imp that he would handle it himself. His entire body was breaking down. His vision started to blur as he looked at the blue imp. His nerves were shutting down. The veins on his face had started turning black. It was obvious his body was reaching the limit. But even with all that pain and with every part of him telling him to give up, he didn't. He stopped thinking too much and just kept moving. And when it seemed like it was all over, and he was finally dead, his resilience ended up saving him. A blue window finally appeared again. It declared that there was just one room left and said that everything about the challenger would now be restored. His body began to glow as the system activated the restoration process. Cecil called out, trying to get Jake's attention, telling him to wake up as he had passed out, more like he died really. But now, Jake's body was healing rapidly. The damage from the acid, the pain in his hand, the ruined leg, everything was restored in moments. Even his clothes were back to normal. He breathed out, feeling the relief hit all at once. Somehow, he was still alive. Cecil let out a laugh, clearly relieved. He had genuinely thought Jake was going to die back there, and Jake laughed too, even if it was out of disbelief. After everything, the two of them sat there, smiling through the tension of what had just happened. Looking down at his palm, Jake flexed his fingers. No more pain. The wound was gone. He was whole again. But the imp reminded him they weren't done yet. A system window popped up, showing a new countdown. The clock had already started. Jake stared at the screen and realized it. One more room. But he wasn't about to rush in. Not yet. He was lying on the ground, still trying to calm his breathing. He said he just needed a minute. Just a minute to process everything. Because a few seconds ago, he was about to die. And not in some dramatic way, but in a slow, agonizing, meaningless one. Cecil looked at him, concerned, and asked if he was alright. Jake nodded, but admitted something. For the first time since entering the tutorial, he had actually felt death breathing down his neck. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a battle. It was just a slow death by acid. He made it clear that while he liked combat and enjoyed all the dodging and striking and the thrill of it all, dying in such a way, all alone and helpless, wasn't something he could accept. Cecil said he understood. He told Jake he used to think he was fine being a loner too. But after spending eternity inside that magical artifact, isolated in a pocket dimension, without seeing another living being, he had come to see things differently. Being alone wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Jake eventually pushed himself off the ground and stood. He cursed the dungeon out loud, vowing not to let it beat him. He refused to be taken down by some system, designed trial. And with that, they both stepped forward and opened the next door. Inside, another room. Another set of challenges. Just like before, the floor was broken into platforms. But this time, something was different. The platforms weren't scattered in strange patterns. Instead, they were neatly aligned in rows and columns, like a grid. They both paused, taking in the layout. It looked suspicious. Cecil guessed maybe Jake could use the same mushroom trick to make his way across like before. But Jake wasn't so sure. He had a feeling this one was playing with his mind in a different way. As he knelt down to study the layout more closely, he noticed something. One of the lines of platforms, the ones running the entire length of the room, each carried the third symbol. It was subtle, but he caught it. The symbol showed a wyvern growling alone atop a desolate mountain. That was all Jake saw at first. No clear instructions, no clues. Just the beast and its roar. He stood in front of it, studying the creature carved into stone, wondering if it was angry. That's what it looked like at first glance. But something didn't sit right. He kept looking and his expression changed. No, it didn't seem angry. Not exactly. He thought back to the beginning of the tutorial, to his own fear, his own panic, and then it clicked. He said out loud that the wyvern wasn't roaring in rage. It was roaring in fear. The realization made him pause, then straighten. A thought formed. Maybe he did know what to do here. He started walking backwards, eyes still locked on the platform path ahead. He was going to test a theory. He had an idea now and he was going to trust it. Cecil's eyes widened. The demon began to panic as Jake neared the blue, glowing symbols. He warned Jake that the glyphs were still active and that stepping on them would almost certainly be fatal. But Jake didn't stop. He picked up speed instead. Cecil shouted after him, frantic, demanding to know what he thought he was doing. But Jake kept running and without hesitation, he jumped onto one of the glowing platforms. Cecil immediately covered his face. He didn't want to watch what he was sure would be Jake's final moment. But nothing exploded. Jake landed, kept his balance, and jumped again. As he soared through the air to the next platform, he started speaking. He said that in the face of fear, the answer was courage. That first platform shattered behind him the second he jumped from it. He kept going, platform to platform. Each one broke apart as soon as he leapt away, crumbling and falling into the abyss. Still he pressed forward. He said that what mattered most was willpower. He remembered everything he'd endured up to this point. All the battles, all the pain, all the survival. And then he said it. The courage to keep moving forward was the key. He reached the final platform and jumped one last time just as the path behind him blew apart in a chain reaction of collapsing stone. His feet landed on solid ground. The challenge was over. A system window popped up confirming it. He had completed the trial. Cecil screamed in celebration. He hadn't expected Jake to survive, let alone succeed. The system chimed in next, announcing that Jake's stats had been fully restored and all abilities reactivated. Jake could feel the difference immediately. His body felt alive again. His power was returning. His senses were sharper. His energy surged. Cecil, overcome with excitement, started playfully smacking Jake's head and called him crazy for pulling it off. Then another message appeared. The hidden challenge was complete. Its condition had been to demonstrate courage. As a reward, a hidden bonus room was now accessible. Jake looked up. Bonus room? He wondered what kind of place that might be. The two of them stepped forward and the bonus room opened up. It wasn't what they expected. There was no danger, no enemies, no puzzles, just a massive mural covering the wall. A story told through carved stone and ancient symbols. Jake stared at it as the images unfolded before him. It began with a serpent. The serpent devoured mushroom after mushroom, growing larger each time. As it grew, wings began to form. Then it took to the skies. It flew over the world, casting a shadow that devastated everything below. In time, other creatures began to worship the winged serpent. They followed it like disciples, offering themselves up as servants. But the creature kept evolving. It fought stronger and stronger monsters. Its strength grew beyond comparison. Eventually, it no longer resembled a serpent. It had become a wyvern, a fearsome, relentless predator. And the wyvern destroyed everything. Even its own followers. It left nothing behind. At the end of it all, it stood alone atop a mountain. The last living thing. It looked up and roared at the sky. And as the years passed and ages changed, the wyvern ascended once more. No longer a wyvern. Now a true dragon. Cecil pointed at the scene and asked if the beast had really killed its own followers. Jake answered yes, it had. Just then, another system window appeared. Jake had witnessed the will of a true dragon. He was awarded plus 10 willpower points for seeing it through. Cecil glanced over and asked what Jake thought the story meant. Jake just smiled and said he didn't know. But then he fixed his gaze back to the final depiction on the mural, the dragon vast and mighty. And Jake said something else. Something honest. He said he would love to fight that dragon one day. After some time moving through the cave, Jake couldn't help but comment that all he was seeing were more corridors. A seemingly endless hallway stretching far ahead. No new things and no enemies, just more of the same thing. He figured it was probably because he hadn't fully cleared the dungeon yet. There was still something left unfinished. They kept walking, but the path was getting darker. The narrow corridors were wrapped in pitch blackness, and visibility dropped to nearly zero. That's when Cecile, the tiny blue demon, accidentally slammed his head into Jake's side. He groaned in frustration, saying he couldn't see a thing in this pitch dark passage and that he was really starting to miss the glow of the shiny mushrooms from earlier. He asked Jake how he was managing to see anything at all. Jake explained that he'd invested a lot of his attribute points into perception. That was a big reason he could make out shapes and movement even in this kind of gloom. But inside, Jake knew it wasn't just his stat distribution. Something else was happening, he could feel it. His bloodline was evolving again. He could sense it. Normally, his perception would spike only in times of danger, enhancing his awareness and reaction speed. But now, it felt constant, always active. He was beginning to notice a subtle, invisible dome around him. A sphere of awareness, like a passive skill had awakened within him, one that never turned off. He thought about telling Cecile. Maybe the little imp would understand. If he was really as ancient as he claimed to be, he might know something useful about bloodlines or passive abilities like this. Jake turned to him and said that if the darkness was bothering him so much, he could always hop back into the holding necklace until they found a light source. Cecile's reaction was immediate and firm. No way, he absolutely refused. Jake blinked in confusion. He asked why Cecile was so against the idea and whether the necklace was really that bad. Cecile clarified, it wasn't that the place itself was terrible. Inside the magical charm, he could still see what was happening in the outside world. But the problem was that once someone sealed him in, he was stuck. Powerless to escape. He had to wait and hope someone would eventually let him out. He didn't want to be trapped like that again. Not for another millennium. Not after what he'd already endured. Jake looked at him with newfound understanding. He finally connected the dots. Cecile had mentioned being sealed away before, but this was the first time the fear behind that memory came through. Trying to offer some comfort, Jake reached out and patted Cecile gently on the head. He told him that he'd never do that to him. But Cecile just shook his head and replied without emotion, "That's what everyone says." Before Jake could respond, Cecile suddenly shouted. He pointed forward, eyes wide. There was light up ahead. They immediately made their way toward it. Jake was cautious, watching the shape of the glow as they approached. He said it didn't resemble the soft bioluminescence of the mushrooms they'd seen earlier. As they stepped through the final corridor and into the next space, they stopped in surprise. They had entered a massive room. Towering shelves stretched upward, filled with dusty old books and scrolls. A faint magical light glowed from the walls and ceiling, bathing the chamber in a warm hue. Jake stared at the scene, baffled. What kind of place was this? Cecile was quick to answer. He said it looked like some kind of library. Jake started inspecting the books on the shelves and quickly realized how old they were. The covers probably looked worn, the spines probably looked brittle, and the entire shelves seemed to be covered in their dust. Curious, he reached out to touch one of them, but as his fingers got close, a blue energy field shimmered into view, blocking him from making contact. He pulled his hand back and remarked that it seemed he couldn't touch the books directly. Cecile, already wandering around the room, called out to Jake from another corner. The imp had found a table and pointed out that there were utensils for writing laid out on top. Jake moved over and tried to interact with those two, but once again, his hand met the same kind of invisible barrier. He stepped back, frowning. Whatever this place was, it clearly wasn't meant for direct interaction. Well, at least not yet. No challenge had been announced, and there were no enemies or puzzles in sight. That only made him more suspicious. He wondered what the purpose of this room was if he couldn't touch or use anything. While he was still thinking about it, Cecile pointed toward an open door in the far corner. Jake turned to look and realized they'd have to keep moving forward. They walked through the doorway and found themselves in another hallway, fully lined with doors this time. Door after door, stretching ahead. Cecile muttered a comment about how the dungeon was starting to feel repetitive, and Jake couldn't really disagree. He opened one of the doors at random and saw a bedroom inside. Nothing strange about it. Just a regular bedroom. He opened another. This time it was a bathroom. Cecile took a turn and opened a door himself. Inside was a garden filled with colorful flowers. Jake opened yet another. And this one was either a science lab or some sort of torture chamber. He wasn't entirely sure which. As they kept going, Cecile said it was starting to feel like they were walking through someone's house or something like that. Eventually, they reached the last door at the end of the hallway. This one felt different. Jake approached, and sure enough, it looked like another challenge room. They stepped inside, and Cecile pointed out the pedestal at the center. It reminded them of a previous one they'd seen before, but something was clearly different this time. There was no dagger resting on top of the pedestal like before. Instead, There was an imprint of a hand. Just an ordinary-looking human hand. Jake looked at it and said it probably meant the challenge wanted him to touch it. Cecil quickly cut in, warning him that after what happened with the dagger last time, maybe that wasn't the smartest idea. But Jake just laughed it off and teased the imp, asking where his sense of adventure had gone. Then, without waiting any further, he placed his hand onto the imprint. Almost immediately, something snapped into action. A spike shot up from within the pedestal and pricked Jake's palm before he could react. He yanked his hand back, but the damage had already been done. Cecil panicked at the sight. Jake fell to the ground, clutching his hand. A bleeding hole had opened in his palm, and the skin around it was starting to turn black. The spike had been laced with poison. While Jake tried to steady himself, Cecil called out again, telling him to look at the other side of the room. Another pedestal was rising from the floor. Sitting on top of this new pedestal was a book. The same symbol of the snake eating mushrooms was etched onto the cover. Jake figured it had to be part of the challenge. A blue system window appeared, confirming his thoughts. It read, Dungeon Challenge, become an alchemist of the evil viper and cure yourself of the poison that runs through your veins. It added that the poison would remain dormant for 30 days. After that, if he hadn't cured himself he would die. He looked down at the blackened wound in his palm. The realization hit hard. Then, another window appeared. Rejecting the challenge will result in full recovery and immediate return to the Great Forest. All rewards earned will be withheld and collected items will be removed. Jake now understood what this was. He had a choice. If he accepted the challenge he'd be gambling with his life. If he rejected it, he'd be cured and safe. But everything he'd earned so far would be lost. He could walk away right now and it would all be over. Cecil asked him what he planned to do. Jake didn't hesitate long. He said there was only one thing he could do. He didn't come all this way just to back down from a challenge. The scene begins in a part of the Great Forest, where a herd of deer grazes peacefully. Among the trees Adam, one of Jake's old companions, is crouched down observing the animals. He's focused and quiet, planning a hunt. In his thoughts, he recalls that he and William had approached the herd from the eastern side. They prepare to make their move. Adam explains mentally that the plan is simple but effective. He and William would attack first, drawing the herd's attention and driving them west. Meanwhile, Bertram would come from the south to cut off their escape. The deer, startled and panicked, would rush straight into the trap they had set up the previous night. The plan unfolds just as intended. At the right moment, Adam shouts for Casper to pull the rope. Casper reacts quickly, and the trap springs into action. A net whips up into the air, capturing 3 of the deer in one motion. It works, but Adam quickly notices that one deer managed to slip away. William, a young man with blonde hair, says he'll take care of the last one. Without hesitation, he throws 3 daggers at the fleeing deer. The blades fly through the air, and one of them hits its mark. The deer stumbles and collapses injured. William grins, satisfied with the result. But then they notice a problem. One of the daggers had accidentally grazed Casper during the throw. William quickly apologizes, admitting that his aim is terrible. Casper brushes it off, saying it's only a superficial wound and not to worry about it. William, still pointing at the now captured deer, says at least they've got enough meat to last for the week. Adam steps up and gathers everyone together. He tells them they did a great job and turns to Lyra, asking if she can help him finish off the injured deer. She agrees without hesitation. An hour later, the group finished up. They've cleaned and prepared the deer, and now they're carrying the meat. Casper looks a bit disappointed and apologizes to Adam, saying he's sorry his trap didn't catch all of them. Adam reassures him that there's no need to be upset. They caught more than enough for one hunt, and that's what mattered. As they walk, Lyra turns to Casper and asks if he's okay, calling him sweetie. The affection in her voice makes it clear they're together. Casper says he's fine and tells her to go on ahead since he and Adam will be taking the meat to the butcher's. After Lyra leaves, Adam smirks and starts teasing Casper. He brings up how she called him sweetie, and jokes that things seem to be moving pretty quickly between the two of them. Casper seems caught off guard by the comment and asks if he's really moving too fast. He says he hopes Lyra doesn't think he's some kind of sleaze. Adam puts a hand on his shoulder and tells him to relax. He says it's the end of the world, and because of that, things should move quickly. People should enjoy what time they have left. Casper, not missing the chance to return the jab, asks if that's why Adam has been sneaking into Caroline's cabin at night. That shuts Adam up. He looks away, a little embarrassed, and doesn't say anything. Casper laughs and tells him not to worry. He hasn't told anyone about it, though he adds he thinks everyone already knows anyway. Later, Adam walks into a tent and calls out for the smith. He asks how he's doing. The smith replies by asking if Adam's sword needs repairs again. Adam says no. Caroline is there too, and he admits that he's not there for weapons. He's there to find her. He tells Caroline that Casper was injured during the hunt and might need some healing. Caroline apologizes, saying she has to get some armor ready for Richard. Adam raises an eyebrow and asks if Richard really has her running errands now. She replies casually, saying that's just how it is. Richard does whatever he can to keep her in his main group, so she doesn't leave his sight. Adam changes the topic, now smiling. He tells her that apparently Casper saw him visiting her at night. He even jokes that Casper might be sneakier than Jake. Caroline laughs and says Adam always finds a way to bring things back to Jake. She tells him to move on, even calling him Oni at the end. Adam looks a little sheepish and says he only does that because he's still worried about Jake. It's been weeks since Jake left and went off on his own in the forest. No one has heard anything from him since. Caroline, keeping her tone light, says Jake is a grown man and knows how to take care of himself. Then Adam asks her what she thinks Jake might be doing right now. Caroline, still holding his arm, chuckles and says Jake is probably doing something stupid and dangerous. Maybe something like fighting a shark. And somewhere else, deep within the dungeon, far from the surface world and its sunlight, Jake was off doing his own thing again. At the moment, he was gathering mushrooms and muttering to himself. He complained aloud that he was sick of these damn mushrooms. Cecile, always nearby with a snarky comment ready, said maybe if Jake stopped eating them, he wouldn't have to keep coming back to collect more. Jake shot back with sarcasm, saying he'd unlocked an ability that let him learn about poisons by consuming them. Then he added dryly that it's not like there were chickens running around in these caves to keep him fed. It was the same monotonous survival routine, mushrooms or nothing. Cecil responded by saying he was doing just fine living off moss and cave water. The imp even demonstrated by opening his mouth and chomping down on a mouthful of moss, telling Jake he should give it a try sometime. Jake didn't seem convinced. After a while they made their way back to the library, the strange, ancient chambers full of untouchable books and peculiar furniture. As they arrived, Jake, who was very much in the middle of becoming an alchemist, whether he liked it or not, asked Cecil to fetch him one of the mana potions. He needed to restore some of his mana before beginning the brewing process again. Cecil looked at him, unimpressed, and asked if maybe Jake could just rest for one night. They'd been grinding away for hours already and the imp was clearly growing concerned. But before Jake could answer, a sharp pain surged through his body. It was sudden and fierce, like a warning. He grimaced and clutched at his side. The poison in his hand was spreading. That made his decision clear. He told Cecil firmly that no, he couldn't rest. Not now. He needed to figure out this alchemy business and cure himself before it was too late. So he got back to work. He began grinding up ingredients, trying to follow the basic principles of potion crafting. The first step was to mash the materials into a paste. He did that. Then came the part where he injected mana into the mixture. That too seemed to go as planned. The last and trickiest part was transmuting the mana into the necessary attributes, a delicate step that required both precision and control. If he did everything correctly, the paste would turn red, signaling success. But as he stared down into the bowl, he saw it turn brown instead. It was another failure. Frustrated, he slammed his hand down. That was yet another batch ruined, and the process was starting to wear on him. Cecil tried to calm him down. He reminded Jake that he'd only been at it for a week. There was still time. But he also pointed out that Jake's wisdom stat was probably too low, and that was why the process felt so inefficient. And now Jake was drained. He needed another mana potion to keep going. But Cecil quickly reminded him that mana potions had cooldown periods. He warned that if Jake just kept chugging them without waiting, they'd become useless and wouldn't do anything. Then Jake suddenly winced again. Another wave of pain hit him. Cecil rushed toward him, asking if he was all right. Jake pulled off his shirt and the situation became clearer. The poison wasn't just in his hand anymore. It had spread across the right side of his body, blackened veins and corrupted flesh now running from his shoulder down to his waist. He was getting worse. Time was running out. This chapter opens with Adam stepping into a room, responding to a summons from Richard. Adam asks if Richard wanted to see him, and Richard greets him by expressing his gratitude for coming quickly. Standing with his arms crossed, Richard gets straight to the point. He informs Adam that one of the fighter squadrons had returned, but there was a problem. A hunting squad sent out earlier had come back empty-handed, and now the camp was running low on meat. Richard goes on to say he wants to send Adam and his group on an impromptu hunting mission. This time deeper into the forest. Adam, visibly surprised, asks him if he meant outside the safe zone, beyond their usual territory. Richard, unfazed, confirms with a simple smile. Yes, that's exactly what he meant. It's more dangerous out there, he admits, but that's precisely why he's entrusting this mission to Adam. He needs someone competent. Adam, appreciative of the trust but clearly unsure, doesn't give an immediate answer. While he doesn't say it out loud, it's obvious from his expression that he's concerned. The risk is higher, and putting his team in danger over a meat shortage didn't sit right with him. Sensing this hesitation, Richard reassures him. He says that if anything truly dangerous were to appear, his own team would intervene. He insists he's not the kind of leader who sends people to die needlessly. Trying to lighten his mind, Adam asks if he could take Caroline with them. Having a healer around would help ease his nerves, especially with how risky the mission was. But Richard, with that same calm smile, turns him down. He tells Adam that he can't allow it. It's not personal, he says. He just organizes his parties very carefully and doesn't like to mix roles between teams. With a quiet sigh, Adam stands up. He accepts the conditions and says he'll gather his group now. Just as he turns to leave, Richard calls out to him again. There was one more thing. He asks Adam to leave Casper behind at the camp. That catches Adam off guard, and he asks why. Richard explains without changing tone. A scout reported a gap in the camp's fence, and there's a chance another group of survivors has managed to sneak into their territory, possibly spying on them. Since he's heard that Casper is an excellent trap maker, he wants him to stay behind and reinforce the perimeter. Adam says he'll let Casper know. Later that day, Adam's team is already deep in the forest. They're surrounded by trees, blood, and the bodies of freshly hunted creatures. Specifically badgers. They're loading them up after a successful hunt. Adam looks over the pile and asks how many they've taken down. Lyra, standing nearby, tells him she thinks there are 8. He agrees, saying not only are the beasts tougher out here, but there are a lot more of them too. He lifts the last one and tosses it onto the pile. William, with a grin on his face, comments that they must have earned a ton of training points. Adam looks at him and points out that William is soaked in blood. He suggests that while the rest of them wrap up the bodies, William should go wash up near the river because he looks awful. William agrees and heads off. While walking toward the river, William's smile fades. He starts thinking. His thoughts turn bitter, focused on Adam and Richard. He's irritated by both of them. He thinks they're starting to get on his nerves and even calls them a bunch of pretentious NPCs. He's getting tired of the whole camp setup and thinks to himself that he can't wait to be done with all of it. But then something in the forest catches his attention. A sound. He stops and crouches down, alert. There's someone nearby. Hidden behind some trees, he peers out and spots a man telling someone else to keep it down. The man warns that they don't know who might be listening. William watches closely. He then sees the second person the man is talking to, which was a woman, who tells him to relax, saying they'll be quick. Then, a third voice speaks up, belonging to another man. He says he just needs to wash his wand. 3 people, unknown strangers to him. And none of them seems to be of the healer class. William notes this and starts to wonder what level each of them might be at. Then, the group in the forest hears something nearby, a rustling in the bushes. One of them suddenly alerts the others, saying there's someone hiding in the bushes. William, now realizing he's been spotted, starts to panic for a second. But he quickly tries to calm himself down. In his mind, he tells himself to relax. He's pulled off this trick before. No need to lose his cool now. The woman in the group, an archer, calls out in a sharp voice. She tells whoever's hiding to come out slowly or she'll shoot. With no other option, William emerges from the bushes, hands raised, trying to look harmless. He quickly blurts out an excuse. He begs them not to shoot, says he's sorry, and explains that he got separated from his team after an attack. He tells them he thought he heard someone nearby and followed the sound. But the girl doesn't buy it. She stares at him with suspicion. William, however, can't quite tell that yet. In his head, he's already half smiling, thinking to himself that women usually fall for that kind of story. It's worked before, except this one doesn't. Without hesitation, she fires an arrow past his head, close enough to make him flinch. He stares in disbelief, wondering if she really just did that. She doesn't let up. She calls him an idiot and says there's no way they'd believe that kind of nonsense. They weren't born yesterday. Then one of the warriors steps in, shouting for William to drop his weapons and back away slowly. William, still keeping up the act, nods and says he's going to comply. But as he moves, the woman shouts at him to hurry up. She doesn't trust him and wants him to act faster. But William isn't planning to give up. As her voice rises, he reaches toward his wand strapped to his left side. She catches the movement and shoots again. But this time William is quicker. He jumps to the side, dodging the arrow just in time. While midair, he draws 3 daggers and throws them at the group. The daggers fly toward the male warrior, who manages to block them using his shield. As the blades bounce off, he yells to the others to catch William. The archer fires 2 more arrows in rapid succession, but William evades them again, slipping away into the trees, while the group wonders aloud what kind of magic he's using. As he runs, William reflects on the encounter. They were stronger than he expected. The lady, still tracking him, has her bow drawn again and declares that she's got him in her sights. But William isn't done yet. He activates his magic and suddenly the 3 daggers he had thrown earlier reappear. One of them shoots forward and pierces straight through the archer's neck, killing her instantly. The warrior sees her fall and shouts in anguish. He charges forward in a frenzy. That's the mistake William was waiting for. With the man distracted by grief, William uses his telekinetic magic again. The remaining 2 daggers shoot out, slicing through both the warrior and the mage who had been with them. The blades behead them cleanly, ending the fight in an instant. Now alone in the clearing, William sits casually on top of the dead bodies. He checks their stats one by one to see what kind of rewards he might get from killing them. One of them turns out to be level 10, and the other 2 are level 9. Smiling to himself, he says out loud that it wasn't a complete waste of time. But then someone approaches. A voice calls out from the trees, asking if William is there. It's Lyra, Casper's girlfriend. She's just found him, and she freezes in shock at the sight. William is standing over a pile of bodies, soaked in blood. She stammers, asking if he did this. William doesn't bother hiding anything anymore. His expression shifts, cold and direct. He asks her why she couldn't have just stayed away and minded her own business as he moves towards her. And with that, she's no longer part of the conversation. Roughly 5 minutes later, William returns to his group. Adam sees him and lights up, glad to have him back. He tells William that they had just sent Lyra to go looking for him. William plays dumb. He asks if that's so, acting surprised. Says he didn't see anyone and casually adds that he hopes she didn't get lost on the way. The chapter closes with a quiet image of the stream where William had come from. The water runs red with blood, strongly suggesting that Lyra never made it back. William had taken care of her, just like the others. The girl was sleeping with the fishes now. After returning from his foraging mission, Cecil arrived back with the mushrooms he had set out to collect for Jake. He looked around, unsure of where Jake had gone, and called out, trying to get a response. But the silence in the air gave no answer, and Jake was nowhere in sight. Concerned, Cecil wandered the area, scanning every corner of the library for any sign of him. His eyes finally landed on a figure lying motionless on the floor. Jake was there, passed out beside his potion-making bowl, surrounded by scattered healing potions that littered the floor like what remained after his frantic efforts. Cecil rushed over without hesitation. The blue imp knelt down next to him, shaking him and calling out, trying to rouse him, but Jake didn't respond. It was then that Cecil noticed something strange. The veins on Jake's neck were blackened and pulsing, a clear sign that the poison he had previously been affected by had taken its toll, weakening his body far more than expected. With urgency, Cecil reached for one of the many health potions lying nearby. Thankfully, Jake had managed to brew them before collapsing, and Cecil was grateful for that foresight. He held Jake's head up gently and helped him drink from the vial. After a moment, Jake began to wake up as his eyelids opened slowly. And with his vision still blurred and unfocused, he could finally make out what was in front of him. He saw Cecil leaning over him, still trying to get him to fully wake up. Slowly, Jake sat up, his movements sluggish and heavy. In a tired voice, he asked Cecil what had happened. The imp responded that he wasn't sure himself, only that he had found Jake unconscious on the floor with all the potions scattered around. Jake nodded, still disoriented, and admitted that he was feeling completely drained. Cecil observed the situation and noted that it probably wasn't just the poison. There were dozens of potion bottles around them, and it looked like Jake had pushed himself too hard. When asked how many he had made, Jake estimated that it was probably around 50. He explained that he had gotten a good rhythm going and that he was even considering moving on to attempting poison next. Cecil, trying to show concern, suggested that Jake should slow down and take a break. But Jake quickly dismissed that suggestion, stating that there wasn't time for rest and that he needed to continue practicing. Cecil reminded him that he still had about 2 weeks left on the timer, implying that pushing himself too far this early might actually be counterproductive and possibly even dangerous. Jake, not in the mood to hear what sounded like a weakling's caution, responded with irritation. He compared Cecil's words to those of his old coworkers, claiming they had a tendency to avoid pushing limits and preferred taking the easy way out. To him, it was a mindset of fear and hesitation, one that only a coward had. This comparison didn't sit well with Cecil, who responded sharply, telling Jake to stop implying that he was cowardly. Jake, caught up in his emotions and exhaustion, went further and outright said that Cecil's mindset was cowardly. That was the breaking point. Cecil, clearly offended, lashed out by knocking the potion, making bowl out of Jake's hand. The bowl clattered to the floor, its contents splashing and breaking the silence that had followed Jake's remark. Cecil stood firm and told Jake not to insult him like that, and realizing he had gone too far, Jake quickly tried to take back what he had said, attempting to apologize. But the damage was done. Cecil wasn't ready to accept the apology. The imp pointed at Jake with frustration, trying to assert his own strength and courage. Then, without another word, he turned and flew off, heading out of the library. As he left, he shouted back that Jake could get his own mushrooms next time. The next day came, and Jake was still thinking about the fallout. Cecil hadn't returned since flying off, and the silence left behind was starting to feel heavy. Jake briefly considered going after him to apologize again, but eventually decided against it. He told himself he needed to keep working, and that Cecile would understand in time. With that thought, he returned to his studies, now diving into offensive alchemy. He had finished reading through introductory materials that covered how to brew damaging concoctions. One in particular caught his attention: necrotic poison. The process wasn't entirely different from potion making. In fact, he noticed that poison brewing shared many steps with regular alchemy. The primary difference lay in how one treated the ingredients. Instead of preserving their vitality, the goal with poisons was to crush it, removing life essence and enhancing harmful properties. After giving it a try using what he had just learned, a system notification appeared, confirming that Jake had successfully crafted necrotic poison. It was a moment of triumph. Without thinking, he called out to Cecile to share the news. There was no response at first, but Jake tried again, his tone a bit softer this time. To his surprise, Cecile eventually appeared at the doorway, asking what Jake wanted. Jake eagerly told him that he had managed to make poison, and on his first attempt too. Cecile, still clearly upset from the day before, gave a sarcastic response, asking if Jake wanted a reward for it. Jake immediately recognized the bitterness in his tone and realized that the imp was still angry. As if to shift the focus, another notification window appeared in front of Jake. It stated that he had reached level 24 in his alchemist profession, specifically tied to the malefic viper path. Along with this milestone, he was awarded 2 free stat points. Jake chose to allocate both into wisdom, noting that alchemy seemed to be proving its value after all. No sooner had he processed that update than a second notification appeared. This one informed him that he had reached the requirements to evolve his profession. The concept of profession evolution was new to him, and he asked aloud what it meant. Cecile, his curiosity piqued despite his earlier attitude, admitted that he had never seen such a thing before and thought it sounded interesting. The system then posed a question to Jake, asking if he wanted to begin the evolution process. Jake wondered whether this would enhance his alchemy abilities. Unfortunately, Cecile had no answer. Still unfamiliar with this development, as Jake debated whether to proceed, another notification appeared, this one carrying a warning. If Jake chose to delay the evolution, it might negatively impact his professional experience and stall his progress until he completed it later on. Faced with this pressure, Jake recognized that not evolving now could effectively halt his advancement for the time being. Seeing no real alternative, he accepted the prompt and braced himself for whatever was about to happen. Within moments, the environment around them began to react. The entire room started shaking violently, and both Jake and Cecile were left trying to keep their balance. Confused and alarmed, Cecile asked Jake what he had just done. Jake responded that he wasn't sure either. Then, without further warning, the world around them warped. The walls, floor, and ceiling of the library twisted out of place, as though space itself was being altered. When the distortion ended, they found themselves somewhere else entirely. Both were now on the ground in an unfamiliar location, and it became clear they had been transported away from the library to a new setting. Jake looked around, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The terrain suggested they were on the surface of some distant world, though he couldn't identify it. Despite the mystery of the place, he didn't sense any immediate danger. Everything felt still. That calm didn't last long. Jake picked up on something, or rather someone approaching from nearby. Instinctively, he turned in the direction of the presence. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, though not entirely human. His skin was covered in white scales and his eyes had the unmistakable appearance of a reptile. The scaled figure looked directly at both of them, clearly trying to assess who, or what in Cecile's case, he was looking at. Jake stood frozen. Though the area felt absent of immediate hostility, Jake's instincts screamed that something was deeply off. His bloodline skill, which had always triggered in the face of genuine danger, remained dormant. That, in itself, should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Every fiber of his being whispered that the being in front of him was dangerous beyond comprehension. The white, scaled man spoke again, breaking the silence. He asked, calmly but firmly, if the two of them, Jake and Cecile, hadn't heard him the first time when he'd asked who they were. His words were casual, but there was something about his tone that carried weight. Before Jake could respond, the scaled man suddenly appeared right in front of them. The speed with which he moved was unnerving. It was as if he had simply bypassed the space between them. Once there, standing only feet away, he repeated his question. What were the two of them doing here? Jake steadied his breathing. He mentally told himself to relax, reminding himself that the lack of bloodline activation meant he wasn't actually in danger. It had never failed to warn him before. Holding on to that rationale, he finally spoke. He told the figure that its own guess was as good as his. One moment, he was advancing his alchemy under the title of Malefic Viper Alchemist. And the next, he found himself transported to this place without explanation. The figure raised an eyebrow in faint surprise, then turned away from Jake with the air of someone going through a social formality they'd rather avoid. In a voice that sounded disinterested and tired, he gave a half-hearted greeting, saying it was nice to meet Jake.
The effort was so minimal it ended up being kind of funny. He then struck a dramatic pose, facing away from the two and raised a middle finger in parting. He introduced himself as the Malefic Viper and told them, in no uncertain terms, to F off. Jake blinked, thrown off by the absurdity of the encounter. He asked aloud if the man was really the Malefic Viper. In Jake's mind, the title conjured images of something more mythical, maybe a giant snake-dragon hybrid or some serpent deity. In response, the being began to shift its form. With a cocky grin, he asked if this was what Jake had been expecting. As he spoke, his white scales changed slowly, and his body began to transform. Large wings sprouted from his back. His entire body elongated and reshaped, taking on a massive, epic form. In a matter of moments, the humanoid figure was gone and was replaced by a towering dark and green dragon with gleaming eyes and a presence that dwarfed everything around. From this new form, he asked Jake if this appearance was more fitting for someone like him. Cecil, who had been largely silent up until now, took a cautious step forward. The imp was visibly shaken, clearly rattled by what he was witnessing. Now trembling, Cecil confessed that he could hardly believe he was truly standing before the Malefic Viper in the flesh. To him, this was like witnessing a legend brought to life. The Viper, still in his dragon form, leaned closer to Cecil and asked if they had met before. Cecil quickly denied it but added with reverence that he was a loyal servant of the Malefic Viper regardless. That seemed to amuse the Viper. He returned to his humanoid form in a fluid transition, remarking that if Cecil truly was one of his servants, and also an imp, then he must predate the very organization dedicated to the Viper himself. Jake, watching this exchange, stepped forward and made a clarification. He said that he didn't know what Cecil was blabbing about, but as for him, he wasn't one of the Viper's followers. He was just someone who had entered the challenge dungeon, nothing more. The Viper's reaction was instant and filled with laughter. He asked if Jake was serious, clearly finding the entire thing entertaining. He began laughing harder, almost doubling over as he wiped at his eyes. He found the idea of Jake enduring the dungeon without any real context hilarious. He joked that he must have designed that death trap a long time ago and expressed disbelief that someone had actually gone through all of it. Jake commented that it seemed the Viper was the creator of the entire challenge, which the Viper confirmed with a chuckle. Still laughing, the Viper asked Jake how he had found the part of the dungeon where he had to feed mysterious items to him through those platforms. Then he brought up the part where Jake was forced to study the Viper's entire history, only to be rewarded with a giant mural glorifying the Viper's accomplishments. That thought made him laugh even harder. Jake, in a quieter tone, noted that the Viper was incredibly narcissistic. Instead of being offended, the Viper seemed to take it as a compliment, flashing a self-satisfied grin. Then Jake posed a more serious question. He asked if the Viper was some kind of god. Without answering directly, the surroundings suddenly changed again. In an instant, they were standing inside a massive throne room. A grand throne sat in the center, elevated slightly, and the Viper was now seated on it. From his new vantage point, he confirmed Jake's suspicion. He told him that if he kept leveling up, eventually Jake would gain a domain of his own. He explained that the process of becoming divine was long and annoying, but the perks, especially immortality, were worth the effort. Jake, intrigued, admitted that divinity sounded interesting, but he also said that he would probably pass on immortality. To him, the risk of death was what made everything exciting and worthwhile. The Viper stared at him from his throne, quiet for a moment. Then he spoke and called Jake's reasoning idiotic. Still, he added with a smile that he liked that kind of thinking. Meanwhile, Cecil was on the verge of a breakdown. Tears welled in his eyes as he bowed and apologized profusely for Jake's behavior. He addressed the Viper as Sir, and called Jake rude and reckless. Cecil was completely overwhelmed and clearly afraid. Through his sobs, Cecil turned to Jake and demanded to know how he could even bring himself to talk back to a god. Jake replied honestly that he wasn't entirely sure. He thought maybe it had something to do with his willpower stat being high. But the Viper quickly shot that down, saying that wasn't how it worked. The Malefic Viper began to explain what stats truly meant for someone like Jake. He said that while stats like willpower could influence certain things like staying calm under pressure or enduring the weight of immortality, they didn't fundamentally change a person's mind. The core of who someone was, their mental makeup, their flaws and shortcomings, that stayed the same no matter how high their numbers went. Willpower, he explained, could help someone handle the endless passage of time, the loss that came with watching the world change while they remained unchanged. But even then, it wasn't enough by itself. One needed certain abilities just to make that kind of endurance possible in the first place. And not everyone had those abilities. Not even the powerful could be sure that they had what it took. He said many beings with strength far beyond imagination had still fallen. Not because they were defeated in battle or destroyed by a greater force, but because their minds gave out. They collapsed under the weight of their own thoughts, their regrets, and their own solitude. Some had never learned to bear the stillness. Some never recovered. And contrary to the common saying, time didn't always heal everything. Sometimes time was the thing that broke them. Jake looked at him carefully. For the first time, he noticed a kind of sadness in the Viper's voice. There was no obvious grief, but there was a heaviness there, like someone who had carried a burden for so long they forgot what it was like to not have it. But the Viper didn't stop. He told Jake to pay attention. This was the true path to power, and it was lonely. The deeper you went, the higher you climbed, the fewer people were with you. Friends faded. Families disappeared. And eventually, you stood alone. Jake walked toward him slowly. He said it sounded like the Viper had gone through a lot. The archer didn't speak like someone talking to a god. He just spoke like one person talking to another. Then he reached out and casually patted the god, like being on the shoulder, saying that sulking in his domain wasn't really helping anyone. Cecil, already overwhelmed by the events of the day, lost it at that moment. He demanded to know if Jake had completely lost his mind. Touching a god so casually, saying something so direct. As far as Cecil was concerned, Jake was marching straight into death without realizing it. But the Viper didn't lash out. He didn't even look annoyed. He just kept shaking his head and said Jake didn't understand. It wasn't something he could explain with words. It was something only lived experience could teach. Still, Jake didn't back down. He replied that maybe the Viper had simply run away because the approach he'd been using wasn't working. So instead of giving up, maybe it was time to try something different. Cecil stood to the side, biting his lip and practically shaking with anxiety. From his perspective, this back and forth was like watching someone poke a dragon in the eye and expecting not to get burned. He was sure that if this went on any longer, the Viper would lose his temper and obliterate them both. But instead, the Viper looked over at Jake. Jake looked back, this time with a calm, sincere smile that said he wasn't trying to challenge him, he was only trying to reach him. The Dragon Lord let out a soft scoff and said Jake was getting all deep and profound with him now. Then, with a shake of his head, he got up. He said that despite everything, he really liked Jake. Almost immediately, Cecil popped back into the conversation and asked if the Viper liked him too. "What about me?" he said with wide eyes. The Viper gave him a blank look and replied, "What about him?" in a tone that made it clear he hadn't been thinking about Cecil at all. Time passed, and the tension eased. Eventually, the three of them were sitting on a cliff somewhere, talking and eating snacks. They had found a strange kind of peace, like old friends catching up after years apart, even though they'd just met. At one point, the malefic being asked Jake if Coraline had really said what he claimed she had. It was a private moment, but it hinted that their conversation had become personal. Cecil, as usual, chimed in with a comment. Something along the lines of, "Woman, am I right or what?" Jakey and the Viper went completely silent. For a few seconds they just stared at Cecil in stunned silence. Then, at the exact same time, both of them burst into laughter. Cecil's began to flail his hands, clearly upset that he was the butt of the joke. He demanded to know what was so funny, but Jake just said it was nothing. He wrapped an arm around the god's shoulder like they were old buddies. The Viper, now laughing freely, teased Cecil and said he was sure the little imp had plenty of experience with imp girls. Jake was still smiling when he noticed a sudden blue window appear in the corner of his vision. A system notification he must have missed earlier had finally registered. It said his bloodline ability had been upgraded. He now had 10% bonus perception, up from 5%. The Viper, curious, asked what the notification was about. Jake explained the increase, saying it looked like his bloodline skill had just improved a bit. The Viper raised an eyebrow. Even he seemed slightly surprised. A bloodline ability, he said, was something rare and interesting. Sensing his interest, Jake asked if the Viper knew anything more about it. Possibly anything the system might not be revealing. The Viper paused for a moment, then answered. He said the system usually didn't respond well to anyone revealing its secrets, especially after what happened during the Fifth Age. Some god had destroyed a smaller universe just to try and cheat the system back then. Then, to clarify, he added that it hadn't been him. Just in case Jake was wondering. Jake let out a tired sigh and said he should have expected that kind of answer. The Viper stood up again, this time with more finality. He said that although this meeting had been enjoyable, it was probably time for Jake and Cecil to go. As Jake got up to leave, the Viper looked at him seriously and said that Jake had given him a lot to think about. He said it wasn't often he met someone with Jake's kind of ambition and drive. Jake smiled and jokingly asked if this meant he passed the job interview, and if he was now a true alchemist of the malefic Viper. The Viper gave him a thoughtful look and agreed. He said that, yes, he supposed Jake was. Then he reached out and placed a hand on Jake. A soft golden light appeared, wrapping itself around Jake's form. The Viper said he was leaving Jake with something he called a small string of karma. It would stay with him from that moment on. The energy shimmered faintly, almost like a mark of recognition. The Viper then said that he'd genuinely enjoyed their time together. Jake agreed. He said it had been a lot of fun for him too. Finally, Jake said goodbye, promising that they would see each other again. After Jake and Cecil left, the Viper remained alone in his domain. He stared out over the empty space, speaking quietly to himself. He said that because Jake had such a powerful bloodline ability, he would need to keep an eye on him. Then he turned, walking slowly toward one of the ancient stone pillars scattered throughout his domain. He placed a hand on it, deep in thought. He said that maybe he'd spent enough time wallowing here. Maybe it was time for the malefic Viper to make his return. This chapter begins with Adam, William, and Bertram returning to camp from their mission. But Lyra wasn't with them. The three walked in with heavy expressions, their silence speaking louder than words. The tension hung in the air as Casper approached them, clearly unaware of what had happened. He greeted them with a tired but proud smile, wiping sweat from his forehead as he mentioned the new fence he'd been working on. He asked for their thoughts, maybe expecting a comment or some appreciation for his effort. But none of them had the energy to respond to that. Their expressions were too blank, too weighed down. They didn't even acknowledge the fence. Adam couldn't meet Casper's eyes. He simply muttered Casper's name and kept looking at the ground, clearly struggling to speak. That was when Casper seemed to sense something was wrong. He paused, glanced around, then asked where Lyra was. She had gone out with them, after all. His voice was calm, but there was a note of concern that hadn't been there before. Adam, still looking at the ground, finally placed a hand on Casper's shoulder. He quietly said that he was sorry, but they didn't know what happened to her. Lyra had gone into the forest with them, and then she was just gone. His voice was low and rough, as if the words themselves were painful to say. There was a long pause, heavy with unspoken fear. Casper's face changed instantly. He frowned, confused. He asked what the hell that even meant. How could she just disappear? That didn't make any sense. His brows furrowed deeper as he tried to wrap his mind around the impossible. The silence stretched, filled only by distant bird calls and the faint rustling of leaves. William stepped in to explain that they had searched the forest for hours. They looked everywhere, but there was no trace of her. No tracks, no signs. She had vanished without a sound. He shook his head slowly, as if trying to erase the image from his mind. Adam added that they weren't sure what to think anymore. They had gone over it again and again, but nothing added up. They didn't want to believe it, but it was the truth. Lyra was just gone. His tone was grave, as if saying it out loud made it more real and unbearable. Casper's voice rose as he asked if they were joking. This couldn't be real, but Adam only shook his head. He said again that she was gone, and that he was sorry. The shock was clearly visible on Casper's face, and for a moment, no words came out. The scene then shifted to 1 week later, inside Richard's office. A man stood before him, giving a report. He said he had gathered new information about William. Richard, seated behind his desk, told the man to continue. His posture was calm, but there was an edge of interest in his voice. The man explained that protecting William might not be worth it anymore. If Richard gave the order, he could deal with the boy rather quickly and cleanly. He even admitted that he already had 2 men watching William right now as they spoke, and they were doing a fine job watching him from the shadows without being noticed or suspected by William or anyone else. An image was shown of William working at a forge, hammering metal like a blacksmith. The 2 watchers, though unseen by others, were in the background, succeeding in blending in perfectly. The man's voice carried a note of frustration at the incompetence of the watchers. Richard didn't seem surprised. He calmly responded that the boy should be left alone for now. He said he knew William's type. He was the type that was arrogant and full of himself, but not without value. Richard acknowledged that William had real skill. A person like that could be very useful, as long as they were properly controlled. His eyes narrowed slightly as he considered the possibilities. The man agreed without argument, and the scene shifted again. Now we saw William at the forge working hard. Adam and Caroline approached him. Adam asked how things were going with the stone arrowheads. William said he had just finished and handed them over. He apologized for how long it had taken. He said he was still getting used to blacksmithing and was trying his best. His tone was a mix of pride and frustration with himself. Caroline noticed the mess he was in and reached out to clean him up a bit. William brushed it off and said there was nothing wrong with getting dirty for the sake of the job. He called out to his mentor Mr. Smith for confirmation. Mr. Smith nodded and said it was a sign of hard work. His voice was firm but encouraging, like a teacher praising a student. Caroline, still unconvinced, asked why he didn't just become a tailor instead. That way, he wouldn't be constantly covered in grime. She smiled lightly, trying to ease the tension. William responded that blacksmithing was fun to him. He liked learning things from Mr. Smith and working at the forge. Caroline sighed and told him to at least be careful around the fire. She didn't want him getting hurt. William gave her a fake smile and said sure. But after she and Adam left, his expression changed. His thoughts turned bitter. He found her annoying. He hated the way she acted like she could tell him what to do. If she weren't as attractive as she was, he thought nobody would be able to stand her. Then his thoughts turned darker. He reminded himself that soon, a war between Richard and Hayden would break out. When that happened, there would be bloodshed and opportunities. He looked forward to killing people, taking their TP points, and leaving all this nonsense behind. His jaw clenched as he imagined the chaos to come. Mr. Smith interrupted those thoughts, calling for William's help to lift some boxes. William snapped out of it and agreed. Meanwhile, Adam entered another tent. He brought the arrowheads to Casper, who was working with intense focus. Casper barely looked up as Adam approached. Adam handed the items over and asked why Casper hadn't gone to get them himself. He suggested maybe Casper needed a break. Casper replied that he didn't go because he didn't want to see someone. At first, Adam assumed he meant Mr. Smith, but Casper corrected him. He meant William. The name hung heavy in the air between them. That got Adam's attention. He brought up the subject directly, asking if Casper really suspected William had something to do with Lyra's disappearance. Casper's answer was sharp. He said that anyone who acted innocent had something to hide. There might not be proof, but his gut told him William couldn't be trusted. He even added that Jake wouldn't have trusted someone like that. Casper's eyes were hard, filled with suspicion. Adam could see how strained Casper was. He reached out and put a hand on his shoulder, asking gently how long it had been since Casper last got any sleep. Casper angrily knocked the hand away. He yelled at Adam not to patronize him. If Adam didn't want to help, that was fine. But he should just leave him alone. The tension between them was thick. Adam backed off a little but said he didn't think Casper was entirely wrong. Still, he pointed out that the way Casper had been acting, like pacing around the camp and watching William like he was prey, was starting to scare the others. People were whispering about him. Some were saying he might snap at any moment. And frankly, Adam couldn't blame them. He glanced around at the traps Casper had been setting up lately. These weren't simple hunting tools for catching deer or rabbits. They looked like they had been made with another kind of target in mind. Casper's demeanor was cold yet passionate as he replied. He said there were things in the forest far scarier than deer. Someone had to be ready to deal with them. If no one else would step up, then he would. The 19th chapter opens with Jake deep in the middle of an intense workout. Suddenly, the silence was broken as Cecil barged into the room. He came in quickly and asked Jake if he was ready. But Jake didn't answer immediately. He continued his push-ups without missing a beat, nearing the end of his count. Cecil raised an eyebrow and asked again, now curious just how long Jake had been going at it. Then, he pushed himself up into a kneeling position and wiped the sweat from his face. He told Cecil that he'd been at it for 30 minutes straight. There was no pride in his voice, just quiet determination. Jake commented on his own progress. He said it hadn't been too bad, considering he'd only been training like this for a month. But still, he admitted he wished his endurance stats were higher. The physical training was helping, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Cecil, ever the voice of reason, cautioned him to be careful. He reminded Jake that there was still a long day ahead. If Jake pushed himself too hard now, he might burn out before the real test even began. Jake, undeterred, smiled at him. He admitted he was just happy to finally be leaving the cave. Being cooped up there had been driving him crazy. But Cecil wasn't so quick to celebrate. He reminded Jake of the condition he was still dealing with. The poison that had entered his bloodstream was no joke. It had been eating away at him from the inside, slowly turning the veins in his body black. If he didn't craft the antidote soon, it would kill him. As if to emphasize this point, a blue notification appeared in Jake's vision. It showed that he had just over 23 hours left before the poison would become fatal. Jake saw the timer, read the alert, and grinned like a man who enjoyed the challenge. He muttered to himself, let's do this. Meanwhile, back at camp, the story shifted to William. He was busy with his hands. Caroline arrived without warning, and the moment William saw her, he stopped what he was doing and greeted her. He offered a polite smile and informed her that he wasn't sure if Richard's armor was ready yet. If she wanted to check, she could. But Caroline immediately clarified that wasn't why she was there. She hadn't come for any update on the armor. She had come to warn him. She looked serious as she told him to avoid going anywhere near Hayden's camp. William blinked, slightly confused, and asked if something had happened. Caroline explained that things were getting tense between the camps. It was still safe to go hunting, but William should steer clear of the direction Hayden's people occupied. William nodded. He said he understood. Caroline seemed relieved. She said it was good to know she could count on him. Then she mentioned how she had tried telling the same thing to Casper, but it hadn't gone well. Casper had his own ideas. William, curious now, asked what Casper was even planning. Caroline hesitated, then said that she thought Casper was trying to set up traps or something like that. She wasn't entirely sure. Casper had been distant lately. He has been cold and unreachable. He wasn't speaking to people, just disappearing for hours or even days. Caroline even wondered aloud how many tutorial points Casper had accumulated by now. William didn't answer that part but reaffirmed that he'd stay away from Hayden's camp like she'd asked. But then, the scene shifted again. Now we were in Richard's office. He sat behind his desk as usual, calm and composed, asking someone out of view how it went. Then it was revealed that he was speaking to Caroline. Her expression was flat as she responded. She told him that it was done. William would go after Casper. That brief conversation with William, where she pretended to warn him, was part of a setup, a quiet manipulation. Richard seemed pleased. He stood and walked over to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. It was meant to be a gesture of comfort, but it carried weight. He told her that he knew she hadn't enjoyed doing it. He understood, but it was necessary. Both William and Casper had become problems. William thought too highly of himself, like he was some clever mastermind. He was always scheming, always plotting something. And Casper, he was a different kind of threat. The way he was acting, Richard said, it was like he could snap at any moment and burn the whole camp to the ground. Caroline finally spoke up. She defended Casper, saying that he was grieving. That was all. He wasn't a threat, just a boy trying to cope with loss. But Richard wasn't convinced. He asked if it was really grief. After Lyra's disappearance, Casper had vanished for days. No one had seen him. No one had known where he went. That wasn't normal grieving, Richard said. That was something else. Then, the scene changed. This time it showed all the things that had likely taken place during the few days Casper went missing when he left camp. A memory or experience of Casper's, important enough to explain how things got to where they are. Casper was shown alone in the woods. He was calling out Lyra's name. His voice echoed through the trees, but there was no response. Eventually, he reached a stream. But what he saw there froze him in place. Two wild animals, both big, aggressive, and snarling, were fighting each other beside the water. They were locked in a struggle, clawing and biting over something. It didn't take long for Casper to realize what that something was. Lying between them, partially dragged through the mud, was Lyra's body. He didn't stop to think. He shouted and ran toward them, waving his arms and yelling as if he was telling the animals to get away. The creatures snarled but scattered when he came too close, disappearing into the forest. Now kneeling beside her, Casper finally saw her clearly. Her skin was pale, her body still. There was no movement, no breath. She was dead. Tears filled his eyes immediately. He picked her up in his arms, pulling her close like he still couldn't accept what he was seeing. He screamed, demanding to know who had done this. His voice cracked as he shouted again and again. Then, through the tears, he noticed something on her skin. Cuts, not the kind wild animals leave. These were thin and precise. The most obvious one was a deep stab wound. It was a clean cut, far too clean to be from some animal. He thought it might be from a blade. His thoughts jumped. One image came to mind almost instinctively, and it was a thought of William. William, who always carried daggers. But the anger was there now, building beneath the surface of his grief. Then, something strange happened. A voice spoke to him. It came from somewhere nearby, but he couldn't see anyone. It was just a voice, calm and distant. It called out to him, repeating his name. Casper looked around, confused, asking who was there. The voice ignored the question. It asked him something else. It asked Casper if he wanted to bring Lyra back. He answered without thinking, immediately shouting yes. That one word was all the voice needed. It told him to follow it, follow the sound. Then, the scene showed him walking into a dark cave, a challenge dungeon. He was still holding Lyra in his arms, following the voice's call deeper into the cave. The memory ended there. Now the story returns to the present. Richard was speaking again. He sat in his office, talking about Casper. He said whatever had happened to him out there in the forest had changed him. Casper wasn't the same anymore. He wasn't stable. He was now a wild card. Caroline was there too. She didn't argue with the assessment, but she said it was still cruel. Casper had been one of their friends. This wasn't just strategy, it was something personal. Richard replied with no emotion. He said the entire tutorial was cruel. That was the nature of it. But he added that it would be over soon. Once it ended, they'd return to the old world. Back on Earth, they could rest. Rebuild. He told Caroline to look on the bright side. Maybe Casper would kill William. Maybe that would get it out of his system. Maybe after that, he'd go back to the way he used to be. Caroline mentioned that Adam would be happy to have his old friend back. Richard agreed. He said that was what both of them wanted. Both him and Caroline. Then, shifting to a different tone, he hinted at something else. He spoke about how all their support and loyalty could lead to something good. He talked about Caroline and Adam having their happy ending. Happily ever after, he called it. Caroline didn't say much to that, other than mentioning her desire to get out of this awful world. She referred to it bluntly as a hellhole. Richard just smiled at her words. Then he remarked how the young and foolish were willing to do anything for love. The conversation ended there. The story then moved to a new location. Somewhere deep in the forest again. Casper was waiting. He stood in a quiet clearing alone, looking around like he was expecting something or someone. After a short silence, he heard movement in the bushes. He tensed, then turned his head slowly toward the sound. William appeared just as Casper had hoped. He stepped through the trees casually, like he wasn't concerned at all. He greeted Casper with a smirk, asking if Casper had been waiting for him. Casper, calm but intense, said it was about time he showed up. Now they stood face to face, neither one backing down. Casper finally broke the silence. He said he had started to think William wouldn't show up. William replied calmly, explaining that Caroline had warned him to avoid this confrontation. But William couldn't resist. He admitted he had seen how Casper had been staring him down back at camp. It was obvious Casper wanted a fight. Yet, William added that he didn't understand why Casper would want to fight him at all. Casper had grown tired of William's arrogance and pretending. He told William to stop acting innocent. Casper was certain William had killed Lyra, his girlfriend. William shrugged and said that even if it was true, he didn't see the point of all this. He reminded Casper that he was far stronger and more experienced, having hunted more than Casper ever had. William believed Casper didn't care about strength or hunting anyway, so why bother? Casper's anger flared. He thought it was ridiculous for William to question why someone would seek justice for someone they loved. The very idea that Casper wouldn't care was absurd. As Casper's anger rose, memories of Lyra flooded his mind. The story of their relationship began to unfold. It was not just a passing thought, but a deeply personal recollection that fueled his pain and determination. They had met for the first time in a simple moment. Casper had introduced himself awkwardly. Lyra had laughed softly when she heard his name, saying it reminded her of a movie character. Casper had been nervous and shy, calling his own name stupid. But Lyra told him she thought it was cute. That small compliment made him feel both happy and nervous at the same time. A week later, they were sitting by a campfire. Casper offered Lyra some food. Then, unexpectedly, she asked him to go out with her. Casper repeated the question back in surprise, as if unsure it had really happened. Lyra blushed and apologized quickly. She explained why she had asked. She said she thought Casper was nice and that she enjoyed spending time with him. She worried she might have been stupid for asking. Casper answered with a yes, but it was unclear if he was agreeing she was stupid or simply answering the question. Realizing the confusion, he babbled nervously, trying to clarify that he meant yes to going out with her, not that she was stupid. Just as he feared he might have ruined his chance, Lyra kissed him on the cheek. That quiet gesture stopped his frantic rambling and made his heart race. Back in the present, Casper's voice was harsher. He looked William in the eye and asked if he had ever lost someone he loved. William's expression grew colder. He challenged Casper, asking if he had truly lost all sense of logic because of this love Casper spoke of. Casper's eyes filled with tears. The pain he felt was raw and deep. He told William that when you love someone, they become your entire world. If you lose that world because of someone else's actions, you want revenge. The longing for justice, or perhaps vengeance, was all-consuming. William responded coldly. He said fighting Casper wouldn't bring Lyra back, so what was the point? His words were like a knife, cutting through Casper's anger with blunt realism. Casper admitted it didn't make sense logically, but he couldn't let go of it. Love was too complicated for him. He believed someone like William could never understand it. It was not something he could explain in terms William would accept. William watched Casper carefully. In his mind, he thought Casper was trying to provoke him and it was working. William reached for his wand slowly, tension rising with every second. Casper wasn't finished. He accused William of looking down on how others felt. He said that was William's greatest weakness. That flaw made William more broken than Casper felt himself. Now holding his wand firmly, William said he had had enough. He warned Casper to obey him if he wanted to spare his life. It was the final warning. Casper looked at William without fear. He told him threats didn't work on him. He wasn't afraid to die. Not after everything he had already lost. The determination in his eyes was clear. He wasn't bluffing, not even in the slightest. The confrontation escalated as William, standing with confidence, declared to Casper that he would now die. Without hesitation, he activated his telekinetic magic, launching several daggers through the air in a swift motion aimed directly at his opponent. The projectiles flew fast, but Casper reacted with perfect timing, sweeping them all aside effortlessly with a single, practiced swing of his spear. Watching this, William paused for a moment, acknowledging internally that Casper was faster than he had anticipated. There had been no delay in the way Casper had moved. It was just a fluid reaction that left no room for hesitation. Casper wasted no time. He pulled out a dagger and flung it in William's direction. The blade whistled through the air but missed its mark completely. It didn't even graze William. Standing unfazed, William began to laugh. The attack had failed, or so it seemed to him. There wasn't even a scratch to show for it. But then Casper smiled and calmly explained that the throw hadn't been intended to hit him in the first place. The dagger flew past William and struck a specific location, an exact point that triggered one of the traps Casper had set earlier in preparation for this battle. As the trap activated, a barrage of arrows was released. all aimed toward William. The sudden danger forced William to reassess the situation. In his mind, he acknowledged that the tactic had been clever. He hadn't seen it coming. However, he responded quickly, using his magic to erect a barrier or shield of some sort, managing to block the arrows before they could reach him. Seeing an opening in the chaos, Casper surged forward. He closed the distance between them, spear in hand, pressing the attack. William began to dodge, weaving and moving away from each spear thrust as Casper continued to strike. But then, without warning, William's leg snapped shut inside another trap. This time, it was a bear trap specifically designed by Casper ahead of time for this very fight. Reacting instantly, William used his magic to force the trap open, freeing himself before it could cause more serious injury. He prepared to make a break for it, but Casper was already on top of him again. He went in with another strike, this time aiming directly for William's head. Although William managed to dodge at the last moment, the spear's edge still grazed him. A thin line of blood appeared where the tip had cut him, marking the first time Casper had actually landed a hit in the fight. William jumped backward, creating space between them once more. Surprised by the cut, William looked at Casper with renewed interest and told him he wasn't half bad. A moment later, he announced that he would now be stepping things up a notch. With that, he began activating more of his telekinetic magic. Dozens of daggers once previously hidden or stored rose into the air all around him, forming a deadly display of weapons that floated above, each pointed in Casper's direction. William sent the blades flying toward him all at once, daring Casper to try deflecting them like he had before. Casper, standing calmly, began to speak. As he did, a black aura began to form around him. He explained that during a challenge dungeon, he had met someone who had picked him up when he was at his lowest. That person had made him a deal. The dark energy around him thickened. With his arms extended outward and his eyes closed, Casper did not move as the daggers flew toward him. The black aura swirled and expanded, and then something unusual began to happen. William's magic seemed to lose its grip on the weapons. The daggers had previously obeyed his control without resistance, now trembled in the air, losing momentum and slowing as if something stronger was interfering. Casper continued speaking, his voice steady. He said that the deal he made had granted him power. The black smoke around him intensified, beginning to twist and spiral into a vortex. He described this power as something born from emotion, a force that thrived not on logic or control but on feeling. The dark vortex condensed, and from within it formed a ball of concentrated energy. Casper held it forward and told William to witness the strength that someone like him, someone without deep emotion, could never grasp. He gave the energy a name. He called it the resentment of the fallen. William, upon seeing the display, froze. The sheer intensity of the aura overwhelmed him. His confident demeanor cracked, and his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. He stumbled backward, and in doing so, tripped over a small rock behind him. Losing his balance, he fell to the ground. Now sitting in the dirt, William raised his hands in surrender. His tone changed completely as he pleaded with Casper not to kill him. He promised to leave the camp if he was spared. Casper, the black energy still swirling around him, replied that he had never intended to kill William. The point had never been to end his life. Instead, it was to show him the power he possessed. He said the fight, while unnecessary, had served its purpose. And before leaving, he added that he still had to hit William just a little. He had to give him something to remember him by. Confused by this sudden shift, William asked if he truly intended to leave now. Casper replied with a simple farewell, saying he hoped their paths would never cross again. Then, with the black smoke engulfing him, Casper vanished. The smoke swirled and collapsed inward, and he was gone. Moments later, in another location entirely, 3 cloaked figures stood in a circle around a glowing magical insignia drawn on the ground. In the center of this symbol, Casper reappeared. He stood before them and declared that he was done. One of the figures, cloaked and speaking with authority, praised him for his efforts. They acknowledged that the ritual had likely confused him, but confirmed that their patron was pleased with what he had done. Then, from beneath one of the robes, a skeletal hand emerged. It reached out toward Casper and welcomed him. The figure told him to rise and to accept his place in the afterlife. William remained alone, standing silently in the field where the confrontation had just ended. Casper had vanished moments ago in a swirl of black smoke, leaving nothing behind. From where William stood, it looked as if Casper had simply exploded and disappeared into nothingness. The scene was so abrupt and disorienting that for several seconds William didn't even move. He just stood there, trying to make sense of what had happened. His mind spun as he recalled the immense pressure and raw power that had poured off Casper during those final moments. He remembered that Casper had said it was a power fueled purely by emotion. That part stuck with him. But whatever it was effective, and more importantly, William wanted it. That kind of strength. Meanwhile, far from the battlefield, Jake, the story's main protagonist, sat in a meditative pose. His eyes were closed, his posture steady, but the signs of his condition were growing worse by the minute. Beside him, the small blue imp Cecil hovered nearby, watching him closely. Cecil couldn't help but worry. Even just looking at Jake was difficult now. The dark poison visibly pulsed through the veins that spread up Jake's neck, and the signs of its toll on his body were clear. He looked like he was in pain, yet he sat completely still, breathing in and out, focused entirely on whatever inner calm he was trying to maintain. In Cecil's mind, the thought rang, if it were him in Jake's position, he'd be terrified. No doubt about it. The idea of sitting calmly with death approaching so quickly felt impossible. He didn't understand how Jake was able to keep it together. And then Jake spoke, breaking the silence without even opening his eyes. He told Cecil to stop staring. Startled, Cecil asked how he even knew he was being watched. Jake responded calmly, saying that he could sense everything. Even with his eyes shut, he was aware. That was a result of his bloodline ability, one that heightened his awareness to an unusual degree. Cecil admitted that he was worried. He felt like he was the only one who truly grasped how little time was left. The timer was running out, and Jake wasn't doing anything. He pointed this out, frustrated, asking Jake how long he intended to just sit there meditating instead of doing something about the poison. Jake answered without panic. He said he would continue meditating until he was ready. That was all. Still concerned, Cecil pushed further, questioning why Jake wasn't trying to brew an antidote right now. He reminded Jake that he had just 1 hour left before the poison would become fatal. Time was slipping away, and this seemed like the moment to act. Jake's reply was calm and rooted in something personal. He thought back to his time in college and remembered how people used to panic before big exams. He had seen how that kind of panic helped no one. The students who freaked out often performed worse. He had learned that the best thing to do in those moments wasn't to stress, but to relax. He compared the situation to archery. The same principles applied. You didn't rush a shot. Instead, you steadied yourself. You breathed deeply. You let everything else fade away until the moment was perfect. Only then did you release the arrow. As he thought this, brief flashes of his archery training passed through his mind. Cecil then suggested prayer. Maybe that would help. Jake brushed it off at first, saying he didn't really believe in prayer. But Cecil quickly pointed out the irony in that statement. After all, Jake had met a god just last week. The malefic viper, a real divine being, had spoken to him directly. Hearing this, Jake conceded. He admitted he hadn't thought about it that way. Meeting the viper had changed things. And it was true that the god had blessed him. He opened a blue notification window and showed it to Cecil, revealing that he had received the blessing of the malefic viper. The notification identified Jake as a true alchemist recognized by the god itself. Jake explained that the blessing came with significant stat boosts. They had helped a lot. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture. The god's power had made him stronger in real, tangible ways. He then mused aloud that maybe prayer wouldn't be such a bad idea after all. Still, knowing the viper's personality, he joked that any prayer sent its way might just go straight to voicemail. Despite his earlier doubts, Jake eventually decided to try praying to the malefic viper anyway. But in typical Jake fashion, he didn't do it the conventional way. He looked upward and cursed at the god, calling the malefic viper stupid and reckless. He shouted that if he were to die today, he'd make it his mission to hunt the viper down in the afterlife and make him pay. It was more of a challenge than a plea, and the words came out with a defiant edge. Cecil, watching and listening nearby, was stunned. His jaw dropped in disbelief. He could barely believe what he was hearing. Jake had just insulted a literal god. Cecil immediately began shouting, demanding to know what the hell Jake thought he was doing. He pointed out that saying things like that to a being like the viper was suicide. If the god chose to descend in that moment, Jake might not survive the encounter. It was madness. Jake only laughed. He waved it off, smiling through the pain that was still pulsing through his body. He claimed that the viper probably liked that kind of prayer. Somehow, he could feel a sense of encouragement, as though the god had heard him and approved of his fiery spirit. It was typical of the bond he had with the viper, which was strange, unpredictable, and unlike anything one might expect from a mortal and a divine being. But then, without warning, Jake's body shuddered. He winced as a pulse of sharp pain tore through him. He began coughing violently, and Cecil quickly stepped forward, asking if he was okay. Jake kept smiling, but it was forced. He half-joked that maybe he was wrong and that maybe that sudden burst of pain was the viper's response. As he pulled his hand away from his mouth, blood was visible on his palm, a grim sign that the poison's effect was escalating. Still, he didn't panic. Instead, Jake looked determined. He told Cecil that he wouldn't let things end here. Not after all the struggles he had endured. Not after the countless enemies he had defeated, the damage his body had suffered, or the sacrifices he had made along the way. There were people he had left behind, bonds he had formed. All of that would be meaningless if he failed to push through now. He glanced at the timer, which showed a little over 44 minutes remaining. That was all the time he had left to create a cure before the poison took his life. Tightening his fist, he told Cecil that it was time to get to work. There was no more time to waste. Jake moved quickly. He began setting up all the necessary tools and ingredients on the table in front of him, which was his working surface. Every movement was deliberate and practiced, the mark of someone who had spent years mastering the art of alchemy. The first step was extracting the juices from a rare kind of mushroom. This required care and precision. He then combined that with a special mixture of blood and aged moss. The process was time-consuming, and it demanded intense concentration. He had to avoid slipping into a haze from the pain. Cecil supported him by fetching more supplies and making sure everything stayed in order. To keep his body from completely collapsing, Jake used whatever leftover potions he had to stay replenished. Despite the burning in his limbs and the dizziness creeping in, he kept working. As the liquid inside the cauldron began to bubble, he muttered aloud that if it was bubbling, then things were probably going right. He moved to the next step, injecting mana into the concoction at a slow and steady pace. He focused hard, maintaining the flow just as needed. He didn't rush. Every second counted, but one wrong move could destroy everything. Then, suddenly, a blue notification appeared in front of him. It informed him that he had successfully created something an unstable form of malefic vita. Cecil, looking over, asked if that was the result Jake had been aiming for. Jake hesitated. He wasn't entirely sure. It wasn't exactly what he'd envisioned, but it was something. Another notification followed, providing a more detailed description. The potion he had made was classified as unstable. It contained an immense level of vitality, but it was highly volatile. The energy within it would begin to decay in less than 10 minutes. That meant they had a very small window of opportunity to use it. Jake, still unsure if it would work, voiced his confusion. The description didn't clarify whether it would actually counteract the poison, but with time running out, Cecil reminded him they didn't have the luxury of hesitation. They had to act. Now, looking back at the timer, Jake saw that less than a minute remained. That was all he had left. Making a decision, he picked up the potion and drank it. As the liquid passed down his throat, Cecil wished him good luck, his voice quiet but sincere. After a few moments, Cecil asked if Jake felt any different. Jake admitted that he didn't, at least not yet. But he could feel the countdown approaching its end. He pointed out that the poison was about to kick in. And then, as if on cue, it did. A violent pulse shot through Jake's entire body. His muscles locked up as a wave of pure agony surged through him, more intense than anything he had felt so far. Cecil, watching helplessly, immediately called out, asking if Jake was okay. But before Jake could even respond, another surge of agony racked his body, cutting off his breath. His knees buckled. He staggered, then collapsed to the floor, gasping as he clutched at his chest. With a strained voice, he barely managed to whisper that he couldn't breathe. The antidote hadn't worked fast enough, or at least, not in time to prevent the poison from advancing even further. Jake's eyes widened in panic. The sensation spreading through his limbs wasn't just pain anymore, it was more like paralysis. His fingers twitched, but he couldn't control them. His chest felt tight, like it was being crushed by invisible chains. He could feel the poison crawling upward, inching toward his heart. Desperation took hold of Cecil. With no time to think and panic overtaking reason, he rushed to the nearby stash of health potions, grabbing anything that looked remotely helpful. He called out to Jake again and again, begging him to hold on, to stay with him just a little longer. The world was fading. His heartbeat slowed to a dull echo in his ears. His limbs turned cold. His thoughts drifted. Standing before him was Adam, his old friend, long gone. Adam's expression was stern, not sorrowful. He looked Jake in the eye and asked, "Is that it? After everything, you're just gonna lie down and die?" Jake, still weak and trembling, shook his head slowly. "No," he replied through gritted teeth. "I'm not done yet." Summoning strength he didn't know he still had, Jake forced his body to respond. His arms trembled as he pushed himself up from the ground. Pain screamed through every muscle fiber, but he didn't stop. With a growl that came from the core of his being, Jake rose to his feet, standing tall even as the poison raged inside him. Cecil, still rushing toward him with bottles in both hands, stopped in his tracks. He saw Jake, who was sweating, shaking, gasping but trying to stand upright. Eyes wide, he asked what happened. Jake placed a trembling hand on his chest, feeling his own heartbeat. It was still weak but steady. Between heavy breaths, he told Cecil that the antidote must have finally kicked in, just barely in time. Cecil's eyes darted to Jake's arms and face. The veins that had turned pitch black before were now returning to their normal color. The dark tendrils of poison were retreating. Jake nodded slowly, confirming what Cecil saw. He had passed the test. The poison had been stopped. He didn't celebrate immediately. There was a moment of silence, heavy with the weight of how close he'd come to death. Jake, his voice barely above a whisper, muttered, "I'm alive." Then, with a sudden burst of emotion, he threw his hands into the air and shouted it again, louder and with triumphant defiance. "I'm alive." Cecil, overcome with relief, dropped the potions he'd been holding and joined in the celebration. Unseen to either of them, elsewhere in a separate realm, the malefic viper observed the outcome from afar. His massive, serpentine body coiled in the shadows, his eyes glimmering with interest. He murmured to himself that Jake had done fairly well. Though the antidote he concocted could have been more stable, the sheer force of Jake's willpower and vitality had pushed him through the ordeal. The god acknowledged that his belief in Jake hadn't been misplaced. In fact, he was beginning to see that this mortal might be something truly special. Back in the dungeon chamber, Jake was still catching his breath when a blue notification window shimmered into view before him. It informed him that he had successfully cleared the dungeon. His rewards would be delivered shortly, and the dungeon itself would close in the next 4 hours. Jake stared at the message. They had done it. Against all odds, Jake had survived. Jake, now out of immediate danger, took a moment to assess their situation. He looked around and calmly stated that he didn't have much to carry with him. Then he turned to Cecile and asked what about him. Cecile blinked, caught off guard. It was clear from his expression that he hadn't expected to be asked. He hesitated, unsure of how to answer. But Jake wasn't just making conversation as he followed it up with a more direct question: was Cecile coming with him? That made Cecil freeze for a second. He looked genuinely surprised, even confused. He hadn't thought about it. After everything that had happened, he hadn't considered what would come next for him. So, he asked Jake if he really wanted him to come along. Jake answered without hesitation. Of course he did. He told Cecile that he wouldn't leave him behind. After everything they had faced together, they were in this for the long haul. Jake raised his fist and said that they were partners. That sealed it. Cecile, moved by the gesture, raised his own fist and bumped it against Jake's. The moment was simple, but meaningful. Something about it struck a chord in Cecile. The imp suddenly found himself getting emotional. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he tried to hide them. Jake noticed and asked him if he was actually crying. Cecil, clearly embarrassed and trying to save face, shot back with a flustered, "If you, man," turning his head slightly to hide his face. Just then, before they could say much else, Jake was hit with a barrage of blue notification windows. The system had begun unloading all the dungeon rewards at once. There were stat upgrades, bonuses, items, enhancements, more than Jake could process in a single glance. The list kept going, stacking up one after the other, covering large parts of his vision. He skimmed through a few of them, noting increases to strength, stamina, agility, and several equipment boosts that pushed his combat efficiency even higher. Cecil watched Jake quietly for a moment and then asked how he felt now, after getting all those rewards. Jake gave a small grin and said he felt strong, at least stronger than he had in a long time. Later, as they walked away from the dungeon's depths, Jake mentioned how good it felt to have his weapons back. He flexed his hand around the grip of his bow, checking the tension, reacquainting himself with its weight. Cecil glanced over and asked if Jake thought he'd be a little rusty. After all, it had been a while since he'd last used them. Jake admitted that he probably would be, but that wasn't what concerned him most. His focus was on his class levels. As an alchemist, he had made a lot of progress. But as an archer, he was still stuck at level 9. That was far behind what might be necessary to handle whatever threats were waiting outside. He didn't know what the current average level in the forest region was, but he had a gut feeling that he would need to catch up quickly if he wanted to stay competitive or survive. Cecile, always one for brutal honesty, pointed out that he wasn't likely to be much help in that department. He didn't have any levels, not a single one. He was purely support. Jake, realizing the truth of that, suggested that if things got rough, he could always stash Cecil back in the pocket dimension inside the magical holding necklace. It was a secure place and had kept him safe before. But Cecil immediately rejected the idea. Jake, curious, asked if he was still worried about getting trapped inside again. Cecil responded firmly. Of course he was. Anyone who had been imprisoned inside a timeless void for a millennia would feel the same. The trauma of that experience hadn't faded, and it made him uneasy just thinking about being sealed away again. They didn't dwell on the subject for long. Soon, they reached the exit of the cave-like dungeon. The moment they stepped out into the open, Cecil visibly perked up. He was excited to finally get a breath of fresh air after such a long time underground. He stretched his limbs and took a deep breath, enjoying the sensation. He looked around and commented that the outside view was much better than that cramped, musty dungeon. The moment was peaceful but short-lived. Without warning, a deep growl echoed from nearby. Jakey and Cecil turned sharply to see the source. A massive, lizard-like beast stood before them, its eyes locked on the two of them. Cecil narrowed his eyes and said it looked like they had company. The tension escalated quickly as more of the creatures appeared, slithering and stalking into view. They began to form a circle around Jake and Cecil, cutting off any easy route of escape. Cecil sighed in frustration and muttered about how they couldn't just get a moment to enjoy themselves. But Jake didn't seem troubled. In fact, his expression shifted. He calmly reached for his bow and readied an arrow. He said it was actually perfect. This was exactly what he needed. It was a real fight. He saw this encounter as an opportunity to shake off the rust and get back into proper form. Yet despite their intimidating presence, Jake assessed the threat as moderate. He had fought tougher opponents, and he was confident that he could handle this encounter. His mind raced, formulating strategies even as adrenaline sharpened his senses. Two of the velociraptors suddenly broke into a sprint, charging toward him from the left. Jake's instincts kicked in immediately. He resolved to thin the herd while the beasts were still at range, knowing that once they closed the gap, his chances would decrease sharply. Taking careful aim, he let loose 2 arrows in quick succession. The first found its mark right on the head of one raptor, piercing its skull and killing it instantly. The second arrow shot clean into the mouth of the other, forcing it to drop dead as it landed heavily on the ground. 2 down. Turning away from the fallen creatures, Jake barely had time to catch his breath when the other 2 velociraptors lunged at him. Cecil, ever watchful, warned Jake just in time of the impending danger. With teeth bared and jaws wide open, one raptor roared as it lunged forward, attempting to seize Jake in its powerful bite. Reacting with lightning speed, Jake jumped out of the way, narrowly evading the deadly attack. He made a mental note of the raptor's impressive speed. Was it truly the beast that was so fast, or had Jake's reflexes slowed? He shook the thought off and stayed focused. Suddenly, Cecil called out again, his voice filled with alarm. The imp's life was at stake as one of the raptors was chasing him relentlessly. But Jake, now fully engaged in the fight and having been spotted by the raptor he had dodged moments earlier, replied coolly to Cecil that he was a little busy at the moment. Without hesitation, the raptor lunged again with a violent roar, jaws snapping toward Jake's head. Instinctively, Jake drew his blade as the beast came close, meeting its attack head-on. With a precise slash, he cut deeply into the raptor's neck, severing vital arteries. The beast staggered, bled heavily, and collapsed to the ground, dead. Jake wiped his brow, catching his breath, and noted aloud that only one more raptor remained. But just as he thought the battle was winding down, a dangerous sensation prickled his senses. He turned sharply and froze. The forest around him was no longer quiet as the bushes rustled and shifted, and more velociraptors appeared. Far more than before, dozens of glowing eyes locked onto him as the pack growled menacingly. A slow smile spread across Jake's face. He spoke softly to himself, convinced this was no accident. This had to be some kind of test from the universe, maybe a challenge designed to measure how much he had grown so far. It was a chance to prove himself. Confident and unafraid, he declared boldly that he would not fail. Raising his blade with determination, he prepared for their attack. The pack charged simultaneously, a blur of snapping jaws and claws. Jake met them head-on, his blade slicing through the air. With quick, heavy blows, he struck each raptor once, staggering several and dealing damage with every swing. The rhythm of the fight was intense as it was fast and brutal. As he fought, his mind kept turning to his own resolve. He vowed silently to himself that he would keep fighting until he became the strongest, no matter what it took. Suddenly, a raptor growled close behind him, attempting a sneak attack from the rear. Jake pivoted quickly, slashing at the beast's body and forcing it back. Then, with precision, he stabbed his blade deep into the raptor's open mouth, ending its threat. As he did so, he thought about how he had already overcome the grueling challenge dungeon. Surely he could survive this as well. Before he could relax, 3 more velociraptors burst out from the bushes, growling aggressively. They surrounded him on all sides, eyes blazing with hostility. But Jake didn't flinch or hesitate. The fight was far from over. Calmly, he drew his second blade, gripping it tightly and readying himself. He smiled grimly and said under his breath, "Let's do this." Aback with Cecil, the little blue imp found himself perched nervously atop a steep hill overlooking the clearing. Despite the height and the safety it offered, there was one determined velociraptor that refused to give up its hunt. Just when it seemed the raptor might succeed Jake, the arrow flew true, cutting through the air with deadly precision, and struck the raptor directly in the neck. The beast gave a strangled cry and collapsed instantly, lifeless. Cecil was finally relieved, his tension finally easing. Jake had finished off the last of the predators. The fight was over. With the danger past, Cecil spoke aloud, his voice tinged with nervous humor and a hint of regret. He wondered if he should have just stayed safely hidden in that pocket dimension inside the magical holding necklace, instead of risking himself out here in the open. Jake admitted that the fight had been far more intense than he originally expected. Despite his confidence, the rapid pace and ferocity of the velociraptors had pushed him to his limits. Yet he told Cecil that it would probably get easier now that he had been warmed up. The adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, and he felt a renewed strength building inside him. Cecil considered Jakey's words but was still hesitant. The imp was reconsidering his earlier decision, now thinking that maybe the pocket dimension wasn't such a bad place after all. The near miss with being devoured by the dinosaurs was a terrifying experience for him. Dinosaurs are not exactly my favorite. Cecil muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Just then, Jake's attention was drawn to a barrage of blue notifications flooding his vision. They were system messages confirming the defeat of all the enemies. Each notification brought rewards, tutorial points, stat boosts, and other bonuses that seemed almost endless. The sheer volume overwhelmed him for a moment, but as he sifted through the details, he saw something exciting. His level as an archer had jumped dramatically. He was now at level 13, meaning he had gained 24 levels from just this single fight. It was a massive leap that left him stunned. Jake reasoned that the reason for such a huge level boost was that the system had awarded him extra points since the beasts he fought were far above his previous level. This was a huge advantage, giving him a chance to catch up quickly to others who might have been ahead of him. Cecil pointed out the silver lining. Even if Jake had been behind others in levels so far, catching up might not be as difficult as he thought. The imp smiled, trying to lift Jake's spirits. Maybe this was a turning point for them both. Suddenly, another notification popped up. This one was different as it was a new skill that had been unlocked for Jake's archer class. The skill was called Power Shot. As Jake read the description, a spark of excitement lit up his eyes. Power Shot allowed him to increase the damage of his arrows by pulling and holding the string longer before releasing the shot. This would be perfect for ambushes and hit-and-run tactics, especially combined with his alchemy skills. Jake thought about the possibilities. He could pre-coat his arrows with poison, but he knew that most poisons lost potency quickly once applied. With Power Shot, though, he could time his attacks perfectly to maximize damage before the poison faded. A deadly combination was within reach, a way to strike hard and fast, taking down enemies before they even realized what hit them. Lost in his thoughts, Jake suddenly stiffened. An intense sensation washed over him, an energy so strong and distant it was hard to place. Cecil noticed the change in his expression and immediately asked what was wrong. Jake told him that he had sensed something far away, a massive source of power that radiated with overwhelming force. Curious and concerned, Cecil asked which direction the energy was coming from, suggesting that maybe they should avoid it. But Jake shook his head. Whatever this powerful presence was, it was worth facing. It was a challenge he was ready to take on, no matter the risk. Meanwhile, back at Richard's camp, the atmosphere was quieter but heavy with worry. Caroline sat alone in her modest room, brushing her long hair thoughtfully. The rhythmic sound of the brush moving through her locks was the only thing breaking the silence. Suddenly, Adam entered, his face tight with concern as he asked about Casper's whereabouts. Caroline looked up, meeting his anxious eyes. She told him there was no new information on Casper yet, but explained that it hadn't been long since he left. Richard had promised to send out a scout by tomorrow to search for any sign of him. Adam didn't look reassured by this news, his brow furrowed deeper, and Caroline moved closer to comfort him. She reached out, offering soft words meant to calm his fears, telling him that everything would be fine. Adam confided that he worried Casper might have gotten into trouble. He reminded Caroline that everyone knew Casper had been targeting William, and now both of them were missing. The situation was worrying beyond words. Adam asked if William had said anything unusual to Caroline before he left. She hesitated, visibly nervous, but shook her head and said no, assuring Adam that she would have told him if she had known anything important. She then pulled Adam into a hug, a gesture of comfort that masked her own worry. The tension on her face was clear and it betrayed the fear she tried to hide.